They sat. Admiral Soren first because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. General Park next, broad-shouldered and silent, one hand flat on the table as though he were already anchoring himself against whatever the next hour might require. Director Hale took the last chair with the brittle exactness of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had moved beyond needing legal force to get what he wanted. Rowan remained by the side terminal with his pad in hand. Marcus did not sit. He stood at the wall display with the maps open in layers. Corridor territory, fuel dependencies, logistics routes, civilian staffing matrices, escort patterns. The Keth network spread across the screen in precise luminous lines, elegant in the way systems built for long expansion often were. Efficient, scalable, inhumanly patient. Marcus looked at it without expression. Then he said, "They executed a diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding on an open civil frequency." Director Hale began reflexively, "The Assembly is preparing a condemnation package and..." Marcus cut across her without raising his voice. "I am aware of what condemnation looks like." The room went still. Not because the words were harsh. Because they were not. They were too flat to qualify as harsh. They had the clean, load-bearing quality of a statement that had already passed through anger and arrived somewhere colder. Hale closed her mouth. Marcus touched the first installation on the map. A logistics hub near the corridor seam. Fuel storage. Civilian maintenance crews. Secondary escort traffic. Their expansion spine runs through 17 major infrastructure sites, he said. Not military command nodes. Not population centers. Not symbolic targets. Throughput architecture. Soren leaned forward slightly. "You're talking about pressure points?" "No," Marcus said. "I'm talking about syntax." For half a second no one answered. Marcus turned from the wall and crossed to the desk. He picked up one of the folders Rowan had laid there earlier and opened it to a clipped printout from Elian's proposal packet. He set the pages on the table in front of Park and Hale. Director Hale looked down first. Her eyes moved across the opening section. Then lower. Then back upward, slower this time as recognition assembled. "These are demilitarization terms," she said. "Yes." Park reached for the next page. Resource sharing architecture. Corridor audit oversight. Installation list. He looked up. "These 17. Marcus inclined his head once. Soren's gaze sharpened. "You think he used the same map?" Marcus looked at him. "He spent 3 years building the correct one." Silence followed that. Not because the room disagreed. Because agreement, when it arrived, was unpleasant. Marcus returned to the wall display. "They have mistaken diplomatic language for optional language," he said. "That mistake survives because nothing has forced a revision." Hale let out one breath, careful and thin. "General, with respect, if you are suggesting unilateral military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process, the Assembly will require consultation across." "The Assembly," Marcus said, "has had 9 attempts at formal engagement returned, ignored, or left unopened. This is not a consultation deficit. It is a consequence deficit." Hale stared at him. Park said quietly, "Marcus." That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Not rank. Not title. Name. It landed and stayed there. Marcus did not react. Park continued, "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. "Read the staffing line." Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. "Now read the evacuation capacity." Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. "You're talking about strikes," she said. "Yes."
They
on
sat.
civilian infrastructure.
Admiral Soren first
because
no,
he was the least
Marcus
patient
said.
and the most
On
disciplined
military
about
mobility
disguising
disguised
impatience as civilian
efficiency.
infrastructure.
General Park
The
next,
distinction will not
broad-shouldered
survive
and
first
silent.
contact with
One
public
hand
record.
flat on the table as
It will
though
if
he
the
were
record
already
is constructed
himself
correctly.
against whatever the next
Soren's
hour
eyes
might require.
narrowed.
And
Director
you think you
Hale
can
took
do
the
that?
last chair with the
Marcus
brutal
looked at the
exactness of
Keth
someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force and
they
was now
already
being
told us
asked to
how.
stand near a
No
man
one
who looked
spoke.
increasingly
Marcus
like he had
let the
moved
silence
beyond
do the
needing
work.
legal force to
Then
get
he
what
said,
he wanted.
They used the
Rowan
civil
remained by
frequency
the
to
side
stage
terminal
the
with his
execution
pad in
because they
hand.
believed public
Marcus did not
visibility
sit.
was an instrument
He
of
stood
dominance.
at the wall display with the maps open
Public
in layers.
visibility can remain
Corridor
in use.
territory, fuel
Hale stared at
dependencies,
him.
logistics
You
routes,
want to answer them on
civilian
the same
staffing
channel.
matrices,
Yes.
escort patterns.
Park had gone
The
very
Keth
still.
network spread
He
across
was one
the
of the
screen
few
in
people in
precise
command
luminous
structure who
lines,
could recognize
elegant in the
early,
way systems
when
built
Marcus
for long
had already
expansion
passed the
often were,
point where an idea was
efficient,
still becoming
scalable,
an idea.
and
Park
humanly
knew the
patient.
signs.
Marcus
The absence
looked at
of
it
notes,
without
the order of
expression.
data on the wall.
Then he said
the tone
they
that meant the
executed
internal
a diplomatic
architecture was
envoy
complete
during
and
a
the
declared
external
public
language was simply
proceeding on an
catching up.
open civil frequency.
You've already built it,
Director
Park
Hale
said.
began reflexively.
Marcus did not answer
the assembly
directly.
is preparing a
He touched the
condemnation
second
package
installation.
in.
Then the
Marcus cut
third.
across her
A
without
route
raising
appeared
his
between
voice.
them. Then
I am
another.
aware of what
Fuel,
condemnation
maintenance,
looks like.
processing,
The room
transport
went
corridor.
still.
Not
Remove
because the
one
words
and
were
traffic
harsh,
rerouted.
because they were
Remove
not.
3 and
They were
throughput
too
slowed.
flat to qualify as
Remove
harsh.
7 and
They
expansion
had the
degraded.
clean, load-bearing
Remove
quality of a
17
statement
and the
that
outer
had
pressure
already
stopped
stopped
entirely.
anger and arrived
Not
somewhere
because the
colder.
Keth would be
Hale
destroyed.
closed her mouth
Because they would be unable
Marcus
to
touched
continue.
the first installation
Soren
on
stood
the
up
map.
without meaning
A
to.
logistics
He
hub near
crossed
the
to the
corridor
wall and
seam.
looked more closely.
Fuel storage,
Not at the
civilian
targets
maintenance
themselves.
crews, at the order.
Secondary escort
His face
traffic.
changed first
Their
into
expansion
understanding,
spine
then
runs
into
through
something
17
closer
major
to disbelief.
infrastructure sites.
This
he
isn't a
said.
punitive sequence,
Not military
he said.
command notes.
No, not
It's a
population
systems
centers.
collapse. Not
No.
symbolic targets.
Marcus moved beside him
Throughput
and touched the route
architecture.
line again.
Soren leaned
The
forward
17
slightly.
points lit in sequence.
You're talking
now.
about pressure
Ordered,
points.
measured.
No,
Almost
Marcus
graceful
said.
in their
I'm
inevitability.
talking about syntax.
It's a systems
For half a
translation.
second no one
Marcus
answered.
said.
Marcus
Elian
turned
asked
from
them
the
to
wall and crossed
demilitarize
to
these
the desk.
installations
He
because
picked
they are
up
the
one of the
structural
folders
basis
Rowan
of
had
the
laid there
disputed
earlier
corridor
and opened it to a
If they
clipped
had
printout
agreed,
from
the
Elian's
corridor becomes
proposal packet.
negotiable. He set the
refused.
pages on the table
So
in
the
front
corridor
of Park
becomes
and Hale.
non-operational
Director Hale
instead.
looked down first.
Park read the
Her
sequence
eyes
twice.
moved across the
Then
opening
once more.
section. When
Then
he finally
lower.
spoke, there
Then
was
back
no
upward.
admiration in
Slower
it.
this time as
Admiration would have been
recognition
too
assembled.
easy.
What he
These are
sounded like was a man
demilitarization
standing
terms,
near a
she
piece
said.
of machinery so
Yes.
exact it had become
Park reached for
faintly
the next
disturbing
page.
to watch.
Resource
You're
sharing
not planning a
architecture,
war, he
corridor
said.
audit oversight.
Marcus looked at the map.
Installation
No.
list.
He
Hale
looked
rose
up.
slowly from
These
her chair.
17.
Then what are
Marcus
you planning?
inclined his head
Marcus
once.
answered without
Soren's
looking
gaze
at her.
sharpened.
A reply.
You think he used the same
The
map?
word landed harder
Marcus
than
looked at
anything
him.
else he had said.
He spent 3
because it was
years building
smaller,
the correct one.
because it reduced all
Silence
the
followed
scale
that.
in the room, not
All
because
the
the room
maps, the
disagreed.
frequencies, the
because
installations,
agreement
the
when it
command
arrived
authorities,
was
the
unpleasant.
probable international
Marcus returned to the wall display.
into something almost intimate.
They have mistaken
A reply.
diplomatic language
Not
for
to the
optional
Keth as an
language,
empire,
he said, to what they
That
had
mistake
done,
survives
to the
because
fact of
nothing
it,
has forced
to the
a
sentence
revision.
they thought they had
Hale
finished.
let out one breath,
Hale put
careful
both
and
hands
thin.
on the back of her
General,
chair.
with respect,
This will
if you are
trigger
suggesting
emergency
unilateral
review.
military
You know
action in
that.
direct response
Yes.
to a public
The
execution
assembly
during
will
an
try to
open
delay
diplomatic
authorization.
process. The assembly
Yes.
will require
They may
consultation
succeed.
across.
That
The
finally
assembly,
made Marcus turn.
said,
Not
has had
quickly,
9 attempts at
not
formal
sharply,
engagement returned,
just enough to look
ignored,
directly
or left
at her.
unopened.
This is not a consultation deficit. It is a consequence deficit. Hale stared at him. Park said quietly, Marcus. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Not rank. Not title. Name. It landed and stayed there. Marcus did not react. Park continued, What exactly are you proposing? Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. Read the staffing line. Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. They
I am
sat.
not asking what
Admiral
the assembly
Soren
may
first,
attempt,
because he was
he
the
said.
least patient and
I
the
am
most
asking what
disciplined about
remains
disguising
structurally
impatience
possible
as
before they
efficiency.
arrive at attempting General Park next,
Hale held his gaze for
broad-shouldered
2
and
seconds.
silent. One hand flat on the table as though he were already anchoring himself against whatever the next hour might require. Because she was the only civilian in the room, Director Hale understood the last chair was that Marcus had already stepped one who had spent her life in rooms and was now evaluating institutions and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had moved beyond medium thresholds to get usefulness under strain. Rowan remained by the side terminal with his pad in hand. His handwriting, normally narrow and exact, had begun to widen. He stood at the wall display with the maps open in layers. Did not correct it. Corridor territory back to the desk and opened another routes. Civilian staffing matrices, Alien's diplomatic file. The KEF network spread across the screen in precise luminous lines, return packets, elegant in the way systems built for long expansion often repeatedly, to make a future legible to people who prefer domination because domination required less imagination. Then Marcus he turned pages with the same calm he had brought to the maps. During a declared public proceeding on an open civil across to Hale. Director Hale began reflexively, request for corridor demilitarization, condemnation provisional draft 7. Marcus cut across her without raising his voice. Marcus said, I am aware of what condemnation looks like. She read silently for several seconds, not because the words were harsh, the room required because they were not. Shared resource frameworks are durable only where pressure is reduced at the infrastructure quality of a statement. No treaty language can hold if the systems beneath it remain designed for asymmetrical force projection. Marcus touched the first installation on the map. Marcus closed the logistics hub near the corridor. Understood the problem. Fuel storage. Civilian described it accurately. Secondary escort traffic, under which peace was structurally expansion possible. Spine runs through 17 major infrastructure sites, to impose those terms. Not military command notes. I intend, not population centers, to remove not every remaining excuse for refusing throughput architecture. The room stayed quiet. Soren leaned forward outside slightly. The office. Station activity had entered full day cycle. No, Marcus footsteps said. In the corridor. I'm talking about a distant syntax. Lift seal opening for and half closing. A second. No one answered. Someone at the outer Marcus terminal turned from the wall and crossed to the desk because people had begun to understand one of the folders even without had laid there earlier that something decisive was taking shape from behind the command office door. He set the pages on the table in front of Park and Hale. If you do this, Director Hale looked down. It has to be exact. Her eyes moved across the opening section. Then lower. No missed windows. Slower this time as recognition. No civilian mass casualty. These are demilitarization terms. No deviation in sequence. Yes. Park reached for the next page. Park nodded once. Resource sharing architecture. That nod was not a corridor audit oversight. It was the recognition installation list. Soren folded his arms. These 17. You'll need fleet assets. Marcus inclined his head once. You'll need signal Soren's control. Gaze sharpened. Yes. You think he used the same map? You'll need deniability on Marcus first looked at him. No. He spent 3 years building the correct one. Marcus's eyes were on the Keth civil frequency not because the room disagreed. The first warning goes out when it arrived on their own public channel. Marcus returned to the wall display. There will be no deniability. They have mistaken diplomatic language for optional language. Hale closed her eyes for one brief second. That mistake she opened them again. Nothing in her had rearranged. Hale let out one breath, careful and thin. More like the moment with intelligent person you are suggesting unilateral military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process. The Assembly will demand the Assembly will require consultation across. Marcus answered immediately. The Assembly, Marcus said, they will have it. Has had 9 they will demand formal engagement returned, ignored, or left unopened. They will demand proof. This is not a consultation deficit. For the first time, consequence something almost visible passed through Marcus's face. Park said quietly, not emotion, Marcus, not openly. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name, as if a line inside him had been pulled once hard. It landed and stayed there. Marcus did not react. Park continued, what exactly are you proposing? Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. Read the staffing line. Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. They already have that. Admiral Soren first, no one he was the least patient no one and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. Bring me the broadcast linguistics team. Broad-shouldered and silent. Yes, sir. one hand flat on the table as though he were already anchoring himself against whatever the next hour might require. Corridor proposal. Director Hale took the last chair with the brutal exactness of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force. Marcus's hand rested lightly on the edge of the desk. Increasingly like he had moved beyond meeting legal to the grain of the wood except the cold coffee mug near the corner. Side terminal that was the only thing in the room not placed with intention. Rowan noticed this display with the maps open and himself slightly corridor territory, fuel dependencies, logistics routes, every version, civilian staffing matrices, left at once. Escort patterns. The corridor outside had become dense with waiting personnel, precise messages, intercepted requests, elegant in the way systems built for long institutions produced when they sensed one of their central figures had entered a state from which ordinary conversation would not retrieve without expression. He moved through them quickly, gathering names, executed a diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding on his door. Marcus's voice continued at the Hale began reflexively, giving instructions not as preparing a condemnation but as completed geometry. Marcus cut across her without raising 10 minutes later with the first stack of aware of what condemnation under one arm and the linguistics lead at his shoulder. The office no longer felt like a room where grief had arrived. Grief was too flat to qualify, but it had already been given work. They had the clean, load-bearing quality of a statement that had already passed through anger and arrived somewhere. Contact became structure. Closed her mouth. Rowan set the proposal draft on the installation on the map. Marcus put one hand on the stack and left it there for a second longer than was necessary. Civilian then he looked up at the linguistic secondary escort. You're going to teach my strike teams how to tell the Keth runs through 17 major infrastructure sites. The woman blinked once. He said. Marcus military command before surprise could become not population centers in the formal register, not symbolic targets, correct tonal layers, throughput architecture. No machine approximations if a human mouth can do it better. You're talking about I want the warning points to arrive in the same language my brother used when he asked them to stop. I'm talking about syntax. The room held itself for half a second. No one answered around that sentence. Marcus turned from the wall did not appear to the desk. He had already turned back to the wall Rowan had laid there earlier. The 17 installations glowed there from Ellion's proposal across the dark. He set the pages on the table in front of Park and Hale. Not revenge in its Director Hale looked down first. Something harder to survive. Her eyes moved across the argument made impossible to ignore. Then back strike happened 12 days later. This time as recognition not because 12 days carried these any symbolic demilitarization terms. Not because Marcus believed in theatrical timing. Mark reached for the next page. The delay existed for the simple reasons all consequential actions corridor audit oversight, positioning, installation preparation, evacuation modeling, route confirmation, civilian staffing verification, weather interference across 3 relay bands, and the quieter work beneath all of it. Marcus the labor of making sure that when the first answer went out, building the correct exact. Silence Marcus spent that. Those 12 days not because the room disagreed. He slept because in short intervals when it arrived required it and nowhere near enough Marcus to returned to the wall to work for him. They have mistaken diplomatic language near his right hand and left it there long enough that hunger eventually became less because nothing has forced a revision. He read Hale let out one maps until the geometry lived in him. General, with respect, he read if you are suggesting unilateral military action began to feel like a second mind moving alongside during an open diplomatic process. He did not speak about grief. The assembly will require consultation across. It was present in the room every hour. Marcus not as visible sorrow, has had 9 attempts at formal engagement, a forced entering system architecture and changing the pressure load on every piece connected deficit. By the fourth day, the command floor had developed a rhythm around him. People moved more quietly. Marcus, not out of fear. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. The sort one develops near heavy machinery or weather systems or surgeons in the middle of difficult work. Marcus did not react. Noise was not forbidden. Park continued. It was simply disrespectful to the scale of concentration underway. Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. The Secretary General's office sent 14 requests for direct consultation. The installation file was dry, technical. The Assembly wanted review committees. Systems required the Joint Chiefs wanted operational framing. He read the relevant section Diplomatic affairs wanted to know in increasingly strained civilian logistics whether Marcus intended to give them anything they could plausibly classify as restraint. 62. Rowan answered fuel what could be answered. Maintenance systems, cargo automation. Aggressively. Marcus nodded once. He had become, now read the evacuation capacity. The membrane through which Rowan the world reached Marcus or full failed personnel clearance window, that was his job now. Assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, not adjutant, 32 to 40 minutes. The strike architecture team worked in 2 shifts around the corridor expansion on dual use infrastructure, tolerance, civilian visibility, relay hijack simulations. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualties. Drilled warning transmissions until trained pilot assumptions are accurate. Exposure could deliver 7 lines of formal register because she had not understood the argument under time pressure. Because she had. Marcus supervised the warning work personally. She said, yes. That unsettled people
Admiral
more than the
Soren
target
first
planning
because
did.
he was the least
Not
patient
because
and
the
the most
warnings were
disciplined
unusual.
about disguising
Human
impatience as
command
efficiency.
doctrine included
General
civilian
Park
evacuation
next,
protocols
broad-shouldered
whenever
and silent,
remotely feasible.
one hand flat
But
on
Marcus's
the table as though
attention
he
to
were
them
already
went beyond
anchoring himself
feasibility.
against whatever the
He
next
was
hour
not
might
satisfied
require.
with functional.
Director
He
Hale took
corrected
the last
cadence,
chair with the brittle
adjusted
exactness
pause
of
length,
someone who had spent her life
rejected
in
one
rooms
entire
where
set
words
of
still
phrase
held legal
structures
force,
because,
as
he
he
now
put it,
being asked to
the
stand
second
near a
line
man
sounds
who
like
looked
an administrative
like he had moved
inconvenience.
beyond needing
It
legal
needs to
force
sound
to
like
get what he
final
wanted.
instruction.
Rowan
No
remained
one
by
in
the
the room
side
forgot the
terminal
way
with
he
his
said
pad
it.
in hand.
Flat.
Marcus
Exact.
did not sit, not angry.
He stood at the wall
as though he
display
was
with the
speaking
maps
from
somewhere
somewhere
past
past
personal feeling,
corridor
in a
territory
fuel
where only
dependencies,
precision
logistics
remained.
routes.
On the
Civilian
ninth day,
staffing
Rowan
matrices,
found him reading
escort
one of
patterns.
Alien's oldest
The
drafts,
Keth network spread
not
across
the
the
polished
screen
version,
in precise
not
luminous
the formal
lines,
proposal
elegant
that
in
had
the
gone
way
to the
systems
Dominion
built
Council.
for long expansion
An
often
earlier
were.
working copy
Efficient,
full of crossings
scalable,
out and hand revisions and
humanly
side
patient.
notes that belonged
Marcus
to the period
looked at it
before the
without
language had
expression.
settled into
Then
bureaucratic
he said,
elegance.
they executed
Marcus
a
stood by the
diplomatic
display
envoy during
wall
a
with
declared
declared public
public
proceeding
hand
on
and
an
a target
open
sequence
symbol
lit
lit
in
in
blue
blue white behind
Director
him.
Hale began
Rowan paused at the
reflexively.
doorway. The assembly
He
is
had
preparing
learned
a
over the last
condemnation
week
package
that
and
Marcus's
Marcus
silences
cut
were not
across
all
her
the
without
same.
raising his voice.
Some were operational.
I am aware of
Some
what
were
condemnation
mathematical.
looks like.
Some men do
The
not
room
enter
went
unless
still,
the station is
not
literally
because the
on
words
fire.
were harsh.
This one was
because
different.
they were not
They were
softer,
too flat to
just
qualify
elsewhere.
as harsh.
Marcus
They
did
had
not
the
look
clean,
up.
load-bearing
Did you know,
quality of a
he
statement
said,
that had
that he
already
rewrote
passed
the
through anger and
demilitarization
arrived
section
somewhere
9
colder.
times.
Hale closed
Rowan
her
answered
mouth.
carefully.
Marcus touched
No,
the
sir.
first installation
Marcus
on the map.
turned one page.
A logistics hub near
He
the
kept
corridor
changing the
scene.
verbs.
Fuel storage.
Rowan said nothing.
Civilian
The
maintenance
office was
crews.
quiet except
Secondary
for the
escort
system
traffic
and the low
Their
pulse of the wall
expansion
display.
spine runs through
Marcus
17
read one
major
line from the
infrastructure
page
sites,
without
he
announcing
said.
he was reading.
Not military command
Shared
notes.
peace requires
Not
shared
population
interruption and
centers.
force projection.
Not symbolic
He lowered
targets.
the draft.
Throughput architecture.
He was trying to make it sound
Soren
less
leaned
like an
forward
ultimatum.
slightly.
Rowan,
You're talking
who had
about
spent the
pressure
last
points.
week watching ultimatum
No,
turn
Marcus
slowly
said.
into doctrine.
I'm talking
felt
about
something
syntax.
tighten in his chest.
For half a
Yes,
second,
sir,
no one answered.
he said.
Marcus
turned
set
from
the
the
draft
wall
down
and
across
crossed
to the desk.
Then,
He
after a
picked
brief
up one of the
pause,
folders
he
Rowan
was
had
right.
laid there earlier.
It was
and
the
opened
most
it to a
direct thing
clipped
he had
printout
said about
from
Alien's
since the
proposal
notice
packet.
arrived.
He set
Not
the
I miss
pages
him.
on the table
Not
in
he
front of
shouldn't have
Park and
gone.
Hale.
Not they
Director
killed my
Hale
brother.
looked down first.
Only he was right.
Her eyes moved
Which meant
across the
everything.
opening section.
It meant the plan.
Then lower,
the sequence.
then back upward,
the targets.
slower this
the
time
warnings,
as recognition
the
assembled.
The
These are
exactness of the coming
demilitarization
answer.
terms,
She
it meant
said.
that nothing Marcus
Yes.
was building now
Park reached for the
contradicted
next
Alien's
page.
work.
Resource
He was
sharing
not
architecture.
abandoning the proposal.
Corridor audit
He was
oversight.
clearing away the
Installation
refusal around
list.
it.
He
That
looked
was
up.
what made the campaign
These
something
17.
worse than revenge.
Marcus
had
inclined his
logic.
head once.
On the 12th
Soren's
day
gaze
at
sharpened.
0530
You think he used
station
the
time,
same map?
the command room
Marcus
sealed
looked
for
at him.
active execution.
He spent 3 years
Present.
building the correct
Marcus,
one.
Park,
Silence
Admiral Soren,
followed that.
Strike Operations
Not because
Lead
the room
Commander
disagreed.
Ilias, 2 linguistics
Because agreement,
officers,
when it
3
arrived,
signal
was
specialists,
unpleasant.
Rowan
Marcus
at the secondary
returned to the
console,
wall display.
and enough technical
They have
staff to run the
mistaken
sequence
diplomatic
without
language
slowing
for
it.
optional language.
No one
he
unnecessary.
said. That
No
mistake
one
survives
ornamental.
because
The
nothing
first
has forced
target
a filled the
revision.
center display.
Hale let out one
G7
breath, careful
resupply
and
hub.
thin.
Fuel
General,
reserves.
with respect,
Cargo
if you are
automation.
suggesting unilateral
312
military action in
civilian
direct
logistics
response to a
personnel.
public execution
62
during an
military
open
support
diplomatic
staff.
process,
2
the assembly
primary
will require
evacuation
consultation
lanes.
across.
1 secondary
The
lane
assembly,
susceptible
Marcus
to
said,
docking
has
congestion
had 9
under panic
attempts
conditions.
at formal engagement
Marcus
returned,
had the civilian
ignored,
staffing
or left
report
unopened.
memorized already.
This is not a
He had, in
consultation
fact,
deficit.
memorized all 17.
It is a consequence
He
deficit.
knew
KE-7's lower
Hale stared
maintenance
at him.
sector would need
Park
4
said
extra
quietly,
minutes if the night
Marcus.
rotation had not
That was the
completed
first
to a
time
lockout
anyone
on
in the room
schedule.
had used his name.
He knew the upper
Not
docking
rank,
ring had a
not
tendency
title.
towards signal
Name.
lag during
They
relay
landed and
congestion.
stayed there.
He
Marcus
knew
did
the western
not
escape
react.
lane looked faster
Park
on
continued,
map geometry
what
than it was
exactly
in
are you
physical
proposing?
movement because the corridor
Marcus
narrowed
picked up
2
a sheet
degrees
from the
at the
desk
third
and
seal
handed it
and
to Rowan.
bottlenecked if personnel
Read the
exited
staffing
carrying
line.
equipment.
Rowan looked
He
down.
knew because
The
knowing was the
installation
work,
file was dry,
and because Alien had
technical,
once spent 3
stripped of
years trying
everything
to
except
save what
what
systems
systems
required in
from
order to
becoming targets
function.
at all. He
Marcus
read the
looked at
relevant
the timer.
section aloud.
Open the channel.
Station KE7.
The signal team complied.
Civilian logistics
Keth
personnel.
Public Civil Frequency.
312.
Cross-locked with
Military
Dominion
support
corridor
staff.
relay architecture.
62.
The same
Fuel
family
reserves,
of channel used for
maintenance
official
systems,
public announcements.
cargo automation.
The same family
Marcus
of channel
nodded
used
once.
during the convocation
Now read
proceeding.
the evacuation
Marcus
capacity.
had insisted on that.
Rowan found it.
Not for
Full
symbolism
personnel
alone.
clearance window.
For record.
Assuming
He
uninterrupted
wanted no
transport
later
lanes.
argument about hidden
32
operations,
to 40 minutes.
covert notices, or
Marcus turned
disputed
back
warnings.
to the room.
He wanted
built
every
their corridor
receiver tuned to
expansion
Dominion
on dual
public
use
traffic to
infrastructure.
hear the same message.
Civilian visibility,
Civilians,
military function.
military staff.
That means every
neighboring
installation
systems,
can be interrupted
neutral
without
observers.
mass casualty.
Anyone
if
who might
warning
someday
windows are
pretend
precise and
uncertainty about
transport
what happened
assumptions
here.
are accurate.
Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. They
Commander
sat.
Ilias waited
Admiral
with the
Soren
strike
first
trigger
because
because
he was the
armed
least
but not
patient
live.
and the most
The
disciplined about
linguistics officer
disguising
looked pale
impatience as
enough to be
efficiency.
unwell.
General
Marcus
Park
noticed
next,
and did not comment.
broad-shouldered and silent.
He touched the console
One hand
near the
flat
mic
on
channel.
the table as though he
Put
were
the warning
already
through
anchoring
me.
himself against
Rowan
whatever
lifted
the
his
next
head.
hour might
That
require.
had not been the plan.
Director Hale
The
took the
room
last
knew it
chair with the
immediately.
brittle
A
exactness
tiny
of someone who had
redistribution
spent
of
her life in
attention.
rooms where
A
words still
collective,
held legal
silent
force and was now
recalculation.
being asked to
Park
stand
said
near a man
quietly,
who looked increasingly
"Marcus."
like he had moved
Marcus did
beyond
not look
needing
at him.
legal force to
The
get what he
warning
wanted.
goes through me.
Rowan
He repeated.
remained by the side
No one
terminal with
argued
his pad
further.
in hand.
The channel
Marcus
opened.
did not sit.
For one
He
fractional
stood at the
second,
wall
nothing
display with
existed
the maps
except
open
open
and
layers.
static architecture
Corridor
of a foreign
territory,
public
fuel
frequency and
dependencies,
Marcus standing
logistics
before it
routes,
with one hand
civilian
resting on the
staffing
edge of the
matrices,
command table,
escort patterns.
the target display
The Kef
reflecting
network
pale
spread
lines
across
the
his
screen in
face.
precise
Then he
luminous
spoke in
lines,
formal Kef.
elegant in the way
Not
systems
perfectly.
built for long
No
expansion
human
often
throat
were.
could have produced
Efficient,
perfection.
scalable,
But the structure was
inhumanly
correct.
patient.
The tone
Marcus
placement
looked at it
exact enough
without
to carry
expression.
authority.
Then he
The
said,
layered meaning
they executed a
unmistakable.
diplomatic
This
envoy
installation
during a
is
declared
ordered to
public
evacuate
proceeding on an
immediately.
open civil
He
frequency.
paused. The precise
Director
length
Hale
required
began
for the
reflexively.
imperative to land
The
as
assembly is
instruction rather
preparing
than
a
threat.
condemnation package.
You have 38 minutes.
Marcus cut
Another
across her
pause.
without raising his
Remove
voice.
all personnel.
I am aware of
Remove
what
no
condemnation
equipment.
looks like.
A longer
The
one.
room went still.
This is not a
Not
systems
because the
error.
words were harsh.
This is not a drill.
Because they were not.
This warning
They were
is
too
final.
flat to qualify
The
as
room
harsh.
did not move.
They had the
clean
Kef language
load
sounding
different
quality
in
of a
Marcus's
statement
voice
that
than
had
it
already
had in
passed
Alien's
through
archived
archived
recordings.
recordings somewhere colder.
Rowan realized
Hale
this
closed her
instantly.
mouth.
Alien
Marcus
had spoken
touched
it
the
like
first
a man
installation
building a
on the
bridge.
map.
A
Marcus spoke
logistics
it like
hub
a
near the
man
corridor
closing
scene.
every door except
Fuel
one and
storage.
informing you,
Civilian
with
maintenance
perfect
crews.
courtesy,
Which
secondary
direction
escort
remained.
traffic.
The
Their
transmission
expansion
ended.
spine runs
Signal
through 17
specialists
major
pushed it again through
infrastructure
3
sites,
relay mirrors.
he said.
Public
Not military
band.
command nodes.
Emergency maintenance
Not population
band.
centers.
Civilian
Not
operations
symbolic
crossover.
targets.
Marcus stepped
Throughput
back from the
architecture.
console.
Start
Soren
the
leaned
timer.
forward slightly.
38 minutes
talking
appeared
about
on the
pressure
main display
points?
and began counting
No,
down.
Marcus said.
The longest
I'm
38
talking
minutes
about
Rowan had
syntax.
ever experienced did
For
not
half a
feel
second no one
dramatic from
answered.
the inside.
Marcus
They
turned
felt
from the wall and
procedural
crossed
data
to the
heavy,
desk.
nerve-frayed
He
by
picked up one
numbers.
of the folders Rowan had laid
Evacuation
there
traffic
earlier
lit
and
across
opened
the
it to a
tactical
clipped
screen
printout
in
from
moving
Alien's
clusters.
proposal package.
Initial lag
He
at
set
dock
the
2.
pages on the table
Correction
in front
at
of
minute
Park
6.
and Hale.
Civilian
Director
lane
Hale looked
clearance
down
improving
first.
by minute
Her
11.
eyes moved across
Military
the opening
support
section.
staff attempting
Then
to
lower.
route 3 cargo
Then back
units through
upward.
the eastern
Slower
seal
this
in
time as
violation of the
recognition
warning.
assembled.
Marcus saw it
These
at
are
once.
demilitarization
Patch
channels,
channels,
she said.
He
Yes.
switched to Keth again.
Park reached for the
Leave
next
the
page.
cargo.
Resource
What?
sharing
Immediate.
architecture. Impossible
Corridor
to
audit
mistake.
oversight.
The 3 units were
Installation list.
abandoned 12
He looked
seconds
up.
later.
These
At minute
17,
19, the western
Marcus
lane
inclined his
bottlenecked
head
exactly
once.
where the staffing
Soren's
model
gaze
predicted it
sharpened.
might.
You think he used
Marcus
the
was
same
already
map.
watching the sector
Marcus
before
looked
the
at him.
signal team flagged
He
it.
spent 3 years
Open
building
lane
the
4
correct
auxiliary
one.
guidance.
Silence
he
followed
said.
that.
That will
Not
expose
because the room
a
disagreed.
technician began.
Because agreement
Open
when it
it.
arrived
They
was
did.
unpleasant.
Traffic
Marcus
redistributed.
returned to the wall
Panic
display.
pressure dropped.
They have
At
mistaken
minute
diplomatic
26,
language for
local
optional
Kef
language,
command attempted
he
a
said.
narrow band
That mistake
counter-instruction
survives
advising
because
personnel
nothing
to
has
hold
forced a
position
revision.
pending verification.
Hale let out one
Marcus
breath,
had
careful and
anticipated
thin.
that too.
General,
He
with
nodded
respect,
once to the
if you are
signal lead.
suggesting unilateral
The override
military
packet
action
went
in
live,
direct response
suppressing
to a
the
public
counter-execution
execution
during
replacing
an
it
open
with the
diplomatic
original
process.
warning under full
The assembly
civil
will require
authentication
consultation
markers.
across.
Somewhere out there,
The
in
assembly,
the corridor cold
Marcus
around
said,
K7,
has had 9
an
attempts at
installation
formal
workforce
engagement
heard the
returned,
same message
again in
ignored
their own
or left
formal
unregistered.
register. With
This
no
is not a
room left in it for
consultation
hopeful
deficit.
misunderstanding.
It is a
At
consequence
minute
deficit.
32, the last
Hale
major
stared at
personnel
him.
cluster
Park
cleared
said
the lower
quietly,
maintenance level.
Marcus.
At minute
That was
34,
the first time
the
anyone in
military
the room
support
had used
staff
his name,
finally abandoned
not
the
rank,
secondary fuel
not
lock.
title.
At minute
Name.
37,
It landed
the
and stayed
perimeter
there.
scans showed
Marcus
one
did
heat
not
signature
react.
still inside
Park
the Western
continued.
Service branch.
What exactly are you
Marcus
proposing?
leaned forward. Marcus
Magnify.
picked up a sheet from the desk
The image
and handed it to
sharpened.
Rowan, not a soldier.
Read the staffing
a
line.
maintenance tech
Rowan
probably.
looked down.
Stopped.
The installation
Turned the wrong
file
way.
was dry,
Then again.
technical,
Small
strict
in
of
everything
everything
except
geometry,
what systems
moving
required
with the
in order to
jerking
function.
indecision of someone
He
whose
read the
body
relevant
had entered
section
panic
aloud.
before the mind had
Station
finished
K7.
updating its map of danger.
Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport
transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. Marcus switched the channel on himself first because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. Continue forward. General Park next, turn left at the next seal. And silent. Do not climb. One hand flat on the table as though he listened to nothing in return. Himself against whatever the next hour might require. Only motion on the screen. Director Hale took the last chair with the brittle exactness of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had moved beyond needing legal force to get what he wanted. 58 seconds, the perimeter was clean. By the side Commander Ilias looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the screen for 1 second longer than the countdown required in layers, verifying corridor what the system already told fuel dependencies, then he logistics routes, execute, civilian staffing matrices, lasted less than 2 seconds. The Keth network spread across the screen in precise luminous lines, of visible destruction. Elegant in the way systems built for long expansion calibrated for infrastructure collapse, scalable, fuel containment ignition, and total systems failure inside the installation's central spine. Then he said, they executed a diplomatic envoy during a declared display. The station became debris, then thermal spread. Director Hale began reflexively. The command room remained perfectly still. A condemnation not because anyone had expected Marcus otherwise. Cut across her without raising finality, his voice. When it arrived, I am aware of what condemnation looks like. Carried no drama. The room went still. Only not the because the words nauseating force of something they were done exactly as intended. They were too flat to qualify Marcus did not look triumphant. They had the clean, load-bearing quality of a statement the debris that had already for another 4 seconds and arrived somewhere colder. Confirmed personnel closed her mouth. The verification rolled the first installation 312 civilian logistics hub near the corridor seam. 62 military personnel evacuated. Crews. 0 secondary escort traffic. 4 minor transport injuries during runs through 17 major infrastructure sites. Commander Ilias exhaled sharply through his nose. Not military command notes. Not quite a laugh. Not quite population centers. The linguistics officer beside Rowan sat down as though her knees had remembered gravity. Soren only now that the hardest part was over. You're talking about pressure points. Looked at Marcus for a long time. No. Marcus then he said, I'm talking about Marcus syntax. Nodded once. For half a second no one answered. That was all. Marcus turned from the wall and crossed to the desk. Not declaration. He picked up one of the folders Rowan had laid there earlier and opened it to a the first printout from Alien's proposal packet. Across the next 6 days, set the pages on the table in front of Park and Hale. Each one Director Hale looked down first. Exact. Her eyes moved across the opening section. The same Keth formal register on the same family of public channels. Slower this time the same recognition assembled. Evacuate. These are demilitarization terms, she said. The same terrible courtesy. The same disciplined refusal to let civilian death do the work infrastructure collapse could do more intelligently. Installation with every installation removed, a pattern began to emerge beyond Marcus inclined his head once. Dominion expansion traffic slowed. You think he used the same map first? Marcus looked at him. Then enough that 3 neutral observers started comparing corridor movement data across the public record. Not because the room disagreed. Because agreement when it arrived was unpleasant. Marcus returned to the wall display. The Keth were not losing battles. They had mistaken diplomatic language for optional language. That difference mattered. That mistake mattered even more because Marcus never widened the campaign beyond the 17 structural notes. No strikes on population centers. If you are suggesting no assassination military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic galaxy that humanity could be require consultation. He was teaching it that refusal had a logistics cost. Marcus said. Has had 9 attempts at formal engagement returned, Rowan brought a compiled response left packet into Marcus's office. This is not a consultation diplomatic outrage from 3 It is a consequence states. Deficit. Private commendation from 2 governments unwilling to say aloud what they were relieved someone had finally done. That was the first time anyone in the room had used this language from the assembly. A legal position memo from Director Hale structured around the phrase demonstrated proportionality under extraordinary provocation. What exactly are you proposing? Marcus read none of it immediately. Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan again. The strike sequence now lit across Rowan 3 dead installations. The installation file was dry. Rowan laid the packet on the desk. Stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. Repeats of the original. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. They across relay mirrors Admiral and Soren channels because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. Marcus was quiet. General Park next, broad-shouldered and hesitated. One
He
hand
rarely
flat on the
asked
table
questions
as though he were
unless
already
usefulness
anchoring
outweighed
himself
caution.
against whatever
But
the
something
next
about
hour
the
might
office,
require.
the map, the
Director
count of
Hale
dead
took the last
installations and
chair
living
with the brittle
personnel,
exactness
the
of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had moved beyond needing legal force to get what he wanted. Rowan chose the
remained
most
by the
careful
side
version
terminal
with his
available.
pad in hand.
Do you think they
Marcus
understand
did
the
not
pattern
sit.
yet?
He stood at the wall
eyes
display
shifted
with the
back to the
maps
wall.
open in layers.
Not all of them.
Corridor
He said.
territory, fuel
On the display,
dependencies,
17
logistics
points
routes,
stretched through
civilian
contested
staffing
space like a
matrices,
sentence only
escort
partially
patterns.
written.
The
But
Kef
someone
network
does.
spread across the
That was
screen
true.
in precise
Because
luminous
somewhere
lines,
beyond Titan
elegant
Station,
in the way
beyond
systems
Earth,
built for
beyond
long
the
expansion
tightening
concern of the assembly and the
efficient,
raw furies
scalable,
gathering in Keth command
inhumanly
structures.
patient.
Someone
Marcus
intelligent
looked
was
at it
already
without
looking at the dead
expression.
installations
Then
and
he
the
said,
old diplomatic
they
maps
executed
side by
a
side and
diplomatic
beginning to
envoy
understand
during a
that this
declared
was
public
not war
proceeding
proceeding
on
on
an
an open
sense.
civil
It
frequency.
was language changed
Director
into
Hale
consequence.
began reflexively,
And the sentence was
the
still
assembly
being
is
finished.
preparing a
The first
condemnation
person
package
outside
and
human command to
Marcus cut
understand
across
what
her
Marcus
without
was doing
raising
was
his
not a
voice.
general.
I am
Not a
aware of what
diplomat.
condemnation
Not
looks
a
like.
politician with enough
The room went
instincts to
still.
sense history
Not
leaning
because the
before
words
history
were harsh,
announced itself.
because they were not.
It was an analyst
They were
on
too
a
flat
mid-level
to qualify
intelligence
as
station
harsh.
belonging to the
They had the
Sindari
clean,
hegemony,
load-bearing
a
quality of a
civilization that
statement that
preferred
had
to
already
describe
passed
its role
through
in
anger
corridor
and
politics
somewhere
as colder.
commercially adjacent
Hale
and
closed
its
her
role in
mouth.
Keth infrastructure
Marcus touched
support
the
as
first installation on the map,
overstated by
a
hostile
logistics
narratives,
hub near the
which was the
corridor
sort of
scene.
language governments
Fuel
used when
storage,
they had spent 4
civilian
years
maintenance
profiting
crews,
from someone else's
secondary
aggression and
escort
had not
traffic.
yet decided
Their
how embarrassed
expansion
to be
spine
about it.
runs through
Her
17
name was
major
Tessa
infrastructure
Vorn.
sites.
She had
he
been
said.
in intelligence
Not
analysis for
military
19
command
years
nodes,
and had achieved,
not population
within the small
centers,
and often
not
joyless
symbolic
profession of people who
targets.
spent their lives
Throughput
reading patterns
architecture.
before anyone
Soren
wanted them
leaned
read,
forward
the
slightly.
kind of
You're
reputation that
talking
made
about
others
pressure
lower their
points.
voices slightly
No,
when mentioning her
Marcus
work.
said. Not
I'm
because she
talking
was
about
famous,
syntax.
because she was usually
For half a
right.
second no one answered.
Tessa did not think
Marcus
of herself
turned
as
from
brilliant.
the wall and crossed to
She
the
thought
desk.
of herself as
He
patient.
picked up one of the
Most
folders Rowan
analysts
had
in
laid
her
there
view
earlier
failed
and
not
opened
because
it
they
to a
lacked
clipped
intelligence,
printout from
but
Elian's
because they
proposal
wanted
packet.
meaning to arrive
He
in the
set the
shape
pages
they
on the
already knew how to
table in
label.
front of Park and
Threat,
Hale.
escalation,
Director Hale looked down
deterrence,
first. Her eyes
retaliation.
moved across the
She had
opening
learned
section,
slowly and
then
with
lower,
some contempt for the
then
speed
back
of
upward,
everyone else's
slower
learning,
this time
that the
as
better
recognition
question
was
assembled.
usually not what is happening.
These are demilitarization terms.
What shape
she
is this
said.
trying to become?
Yes.
On the
Park
18th
reached
day
for
of
the
the
next
campaign,
page.
she sat alone
Resource
in
sharing
Office 14
architecture.
Blue on the Sindari
Corridor
Outer
audit
Administration
oversight.
ring with the room
Installation
lights dimmed
list.
to a level no
He
one
looked
else
up.
liked and the first 6 strike
V17.
reports opened
Marcus
side by side
inclined his
across
head
her
once.
desk display.
Soren's
The
gaze
office was
sharpened.
narrow, quiet,
You think he
and
used the same
aggressively
map?
unmemorable.
Marcus looked at him.
Standard gray-green
He
wall
spent
panels.
3 years building
one
the correct
recessed
one.
shelf.
Silence
Screens.
followed that. No viewport.
Not because the room
The
disagreed.
hegemony believed
because
Windows
agreement
distracted
when it arrived
analysts
was
with
a
the
false
false
drama of stars.
Marcus returned
Tessa
to the
had
wall
long
display.
ago stopped minding.
They have mistaken diplomatic
data
language
scenery.
for optional language.
On the center
display,
the
six
six
installations
installations
glowed
because
as nothing has
sequence
crossed
across the
the disputed
disputed
corridor map.
Hale let out one breath,
K7,
careful and
K12,
thin. General,
K3,
with respect,
K19,
if you are suggesting
K8,
unilateral
K14.
military action in
Each
direct
one
response to
warned
a public
publicly.
execution
Each
during
one
an open
evacuated.
diplomatic process,
Each one erased.
the Assembly will
The
require
official hegemony
consultation
briefing
across.
summary had
The
classified
Assembly,
the campaign
Marcus
under
said,
the usual
has
language.
had 9 attempts at
Targeted
formal
retaliatory
engagement returned,
infrastructure
ignored,
suppression
or left
following
unopened.
diplomatic breach.
This is not a consultation
Tessa had read that
deficit.
summary once and
It is a
filed it mentally
consequence
under
deficit.
documents written by
Hale
people trying
stared
to
at
make
him.
unfamiliar
Park said
intelligence sound
quietly,
familiar enough to
Marcus.
survive committee
That was the
review.
first time
Then
anyone
she
in the
had
room
pulled
had
the
used
raw
his
pattern
name.
herself, not rank.
She studied the
not
installations
title.
again.
Name, not the names.
It landed and stayed
the
there.
order. Marcus
Order
did
mattered.
not react.
Any species
Park
with
continued,
ships could
what
destroy
exactly
enough
are
things
you
to create the
proposing?
appearance of strategy
Marcus
after
picked
the
up a
fact.
sheet from the desk
Real
and handed
strategy
it to
revealed
Rowan.
itself in
Read the
sequence.
staffing line.
In the ugly,
Rowan looked
unromantic
down.
choices a
The
planner
installation
made about
file
what
was
came
dry,
first,
technical,
what waited,
and
stripped
what
of
was
everything
left
except
long
what
enough to
systems
continue
required
proving
in order
a
to
point.
function.
She
He
enlarged
read
the
the
relevant
relevant
section
section
aloud. Fuel.
Station
Maintenance,
KE7.
Logistics
Civilian
transfer.
logistics personnel.
Civilian handling.
312.
Throughput nodes. Military
The
sequence
support
was
staff.
too clean.
62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation.
Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming
assuming uninterrupted transport lanes. 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. "You're talking about strikes," she said. "Yes. Not symmetrical." Admiral Soren
Symmetry
first
was
because he was the least
and no one
patient
in
and the
active
most
operations
disciplined
had
about
time for
disguising
decorative,
impatience as
but
efficiency.
clean in the more serious
General
way.
Park next,
Each strike
impairing
impairing 2
silent.
future routes and
one
one
hand
prior
flat on the
contingency.
table as though he were
Each
already
removal
anchoring
reducing
himself
not merely
against whatever
movement,
the
but
next hour might
confidence in
require.
movement.
Director Hale took the last chair with the
brittle
more
exactness
cautious,
of someone who had
then
spent her
slower,
life
then
in
denser
rooms
in
where
the
words
surviving
still held
channels.
legal force.
She
and was
leaned
now
back,
being asked to
folded
stand
her
near a man
arms.
who looked
Read the
increasingly
order
like he had
again.
moved beyond
This is
needing
wrong,
legal force
she said
to get what
aloud
he
to the
wanted.
empty office.
Rowan remained by the
morally
side
wrong.
terminal with his pad in
Analytically
hand.
wrong. The
Marcus did not
classification was
sit.
wrong.
He stood at the wall
Retaliation
display
as a
with the maps
category
open in
assumed
layers.
emotional priority.
Corridor territory,
Punishment
fuel
first.
dependencies,
Pattern
logistics
later.
routes,
Damage as
civilian
message.
staffing matrices.
This sequence did
escort
not behave
patterns.
that way.
The
This
KES network
sequence
spread
behaved
across
like
the
correction.
screen in precise
Tessa pulled a
luminous
second
lines,
file set.
elegant in the way
Dominion
systems
corridor
built for long
policy
expansions
proposals
over
were
the last 5
efficient,
years.
scalable,
Public and semi-public
inhumanly
only.
patient.
Hegemony
Marcus looked at
intelligence
it
had
without
more
expression.
restricted collections
Then he
available,
said,
of course,
they
but she
executed a
preferred
diplomatic
beginning where
envoy
lies
during
were
a
most
declared
carefully
public
dressed.
proceeding on an
Public
open civil
documents
frequency.
often revealed more
Director
through
Hale
phrasing
began
than classified ones
reflexively,
did through
the
content.
Assembly is preparing
Most
a
of the
condemnation
proposals were
package
useless.
and
Marcus cut
procedural
across
noise,
her without raising
neutral
his
state
voice.
recommendations
I am
designed
aware of
never
what
to be
condemnation
adopted.
looks like.
The
Trade balancing
room went
language from
still,
governments too
not because
small
the
to
words were
enforce what they
harsh,
suggested.
because they were not.
Then she found the
They were
human
too
packet,
flat to qualify
not because
as
it was
harsh.
hidden. They had
Because
the
no
clean,
one had bothered
load-bearing
to
quality of a
prioritize it.
statement that had
UA
already
corridor
passed through anger
stabilization
and arrived
proposal.
somewhere colder.
Envoy Elian
Hale
Vale,
closed her
draft
mouth.
summary.
Marcus
Tessa
touched the
opened
first
it.
installation
Read the
on the
first
map.
page.
A
Then the
logistics
second.
hub near the corridor
Then sat
seam.
forward so
Fuel
quickly her
storage.
chair wheels clicked
Civilian
against the
maintenance
floor
crews.
screws.
There it is,
Secondary
she thought.
escort traffic.
Not a full thought.
Their
The
expansion
sensation
spine
first.
runs through
The
17
prickling,
major infrastructure
almost physical
sites,
awareness
he said.
that came when
Not
scattered
military
lines
command
abruptly
notes.
began
Not
recognizing
population
each other.
centers.
She opened the
Not
long
symbolic
version.
targets.
Read more.
Throughput
The document was
architecture.
dense,
Soren
carefully
leaned
argued,
forward slightly.
and
You're
uncharacteristically
talking about
free of the
pressure
moral
points.
vanity that usually
No,
infected
Marcus
human
said.
diplomatic
I'm
writing when
talking
it
about
addressed
syntax.
species the assembly
For
disapproved
half a
of.
second no one answered.
Elian Vale's language
Marcus
was
turned from
technical
the
where it
wall and
needed to
crossed
be
to the
technical.
desk.
Restrained
picked
where
up one of the
emotion might
folders
have been
Rowan
cheap,
had laid there
and,
earlier and
most
opened it to a
interestingly,
clipped printout
structured
from
around
Elian's
infrastructure
proposal
before
packet.
ideology. He set the pages
Shared
on the table in
corridors.
front of Park and Hale.
Demilitarization buffers.
Director Hale looked down
Resource
first.
transparency.
Her eyes moved across
17
the
key
opening
installations
section, requiring
then lower,
military withdrawal
then back
as a
upward,
condition of
slower
durable
this
stability.
time
as recognition
Tessa
assembled.
froze.
Then
she
these are
split the display.
demilitarization terms.
Proposal
she
on the
said.
left. Yes.
Strike map on the
Park
right.
reached for the next
Installation
page.
list beneath
Resource
both.
sharing architecture.
Her eyes moved
Corridor
once down the
audit
left
oversight.
column,
Installation
once down the right,
list.
then
He
again
looked up.
slower.
These
Her
17.
mouth opened slightly. Marcus
Not
inclined
from
his
shock.
head once.
From confirmation.
Soren's gaze sharpened. The 6
he
installations
used
Marcus
the same
Vale
map?
had already destroyed
Marcus
were
looked
not
at him.
approximately
He
aligned
spent
with
3
Elian
years
Vale's
building the
treaty
correct
proposal.
one.
They were
Silence
exact.
followed that.
Not 6
Not
similar
because the room
nodes.
disagreed.
Not 6
because
strategically
agreement when it
adjacent
arrived
options
was
among
unpleasant.
dozens.
The same
Marcus
6,
returned to the wall
in the
display.
same structural logic.
They have mistaken
the same
diplomatic
spine.
language for
For
optional
several
language.
seconds,
Tessa
he
did
said.
not move at all. That mistake
Then she
survives
stood up
because
because
nothing has
sometimes the
forced a
body
revision.
required physical
Hale let out
participation
one breath,
when the mind
careful
crossed
and
from
thin.
uncertainty into
General, with
understanding.
respect, if
She
you are
crossed the
suggesting
office once and
unilateral
back.
military action
Sat
in
again.
direct response
Pulled
to
the
a
next
public
3 strike
execution
reports.
during an open
Compared
diplomatic
them
process,
to the remaining 11
the assembly will
proposed
require
demilitarization
consultation
sites.
across.
A cold
The assembly,
sensation entered her
Marcus said,
hands.
has had
Not
9
fear
attempts at
exactly.
formal engagement,
Professional
returned,
recognition at a
ignored,
scale
or left
large
unopened.
enough to resemble
This
fear
is
from
not a
nearby.
consultation deficit.
He isn't making
It is a
war,
consequence
she said to the
deficit.
empty room.
Hale
The room,
stared at
having
him.
no opinion,
Park said
remained
quietly,
office-shaped and
Marcus.
silent.
That was
Tessa
the first time
enlarged the
anyone in the
proposal
room had
language.
used his name.
Not symmetrical.
Not rank.
Not
Symmetry
title.
was decorative,
Name.
and no
It
one in
landed and
active
stayed there.
operations had time
Marcus
for
did
decorative.
not react,
but clean
Park
in the more
continued.
serious way. What exactly
Each
are
strike
you proposing?
impairing
2 future
Marcus
routes
picked
and
up
1
a
sheet
sheet
from the desk and handed it to
Each
Rowan.
removal reducing
Read the
not
staffing
merely
line,
movement,
but confidence
Rowan
in
looked
movement.
down.
The installation
forcing
file was
Dominion
dry,
traffic to
technical,
become more cautious,
stripped of everything
then slower,
except what
then
systems
denser in the
required in
surviving
order to
channels.
function.
She leaned
He
back,
read the relevant
folded
section
her
aloud.
arms.
Read the
Station
order
K7.
again. This is
Civilian
wrong,
logistics
she said aloud
personnel,
to the empty office.
312.
Not morally wrong.
Military support
Analytically
staff,
wrong.
62.
The classification
Fuel
was
reserves,
wrong. Retaliation
systems,
as a
cargo
category
automation.
assumed emotional priority.
Marcus nodded once.
Punishment first.
Now read the
Pattern
evacuation
later.
capacity.
Damage as message.
Rowan found it.
This sequence did
Full
not
personnel
behave that
clearance
way.
window.
This sequence behaved like
uninterrupted
correction.
transport lanes.
Tessa pulled a
32
second
to
file
40
set.
minutes.
Dominion
Marcus
corridor
turned back
policy
to the room.
proposals over the
They
last
built their
5
corridor
years.
expansion
Public
on
and
dual-use
semi-public
infrastructure.
only.
Civilian
Hegemony
intelligence
intelligence
had
military
more restricted
function.
collections
That
available,
means
of
every
course,
installation
but
can
she
be
preferred
interrupted
beginning
without
where
mass
lies were most
casualty if
carefully
warning
dressed.
windows are
Public
precise and
documents often
transport
revealed
assumptions are
more
accurate.
through phrasing than
Hale's
classified
face
ones did
changed.
through content.
Not because she
Most
had not
of the
understood the
proposals were
argument,
useless,
because she had.
procedural noise.
You're talking about
neutral
strikes,
state recommendations designed
Yes.
never to be adopted. Trade balancing language from governments too small to enforce what they suggested. Then she found the human packet. Not because it was hidden. Because no one had bothered to prioritize it. UA Corridor Stabilization Proposal. Envoy Elian Vale. Draft Summary. Tessa opened it. Read the first page. Then the second. Then sat forward so quickly her chair wheels clicked against the floor seam. There it is, she thought. Not a full thought. A sensation first. The prickling, almost physical awareness that came when scattered lines abruptly began recognizing each other. She opened the long version. Read more. The document was dense, carefully argued, and uncharacteristically free of the moral vanity that usually infected human diplomatic writing when it addressed species the assembly disapproved of. Elian Vale's language was technical where it needed to be technical, restrained where emotion might have been cheap, and, most interestingly, structured around infrastructure before ideology. Shared corridors. Demilitarization buffers. Resource transparency. 17 key installations requiring military withdrawal as a condition of durable stability. Tessa froze. Then she split the display. Proposal on the left. Strike map on the right. Installation list beneath both. Her eyes moved once down the left column. Once down the right. Then again slower. Her mouth opened slightly. Not from shock. From confirmation. The 6 installations Marcus Vale had already destroyed were not approximately aligned with Elian Vale's treaty proposal. They were exact. Not 6 similar nodes. Not 6 strategically adjacent options among dozens. The same 6. In the same structural logic. The same spine. For several seconds Tessa did not move at all. Then she stood up because sometimes the body required physical participation when the mind crossed from uncertainty into understanding. She crossed the office once and back. Sat again. Pulled the next 3 strike reports. Compared them to the remaining 11 proposed demilitarization sites. A cold sensation entered her hands. Not fear exactly. Professional recognition at a scale large enough to resemble fear from nearby. He isn't making war, she said to the empty room. The room, having no opinion, remained office-shaped and silent. Tessa enlarged the proposal language. One line in particular. Admiral Soren first because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. Map. General Vale was not avenging his brother in the usual sense. One hand flat on the table as though he would have targeted anchoring himself against whatever the next hour might require. Director Hale took the last chair with the brutal exactness of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had moved beyond needing legal force to get what he wanted. Marcus had taken Elian's rejected treaty and begun building it with orbital fire. He stood at the wall display to demilitarize the corridor. Layers, making continued militarization impossible. Logistics he wasn't destroying civilian staffing matrices. He was removing the refusal around it. The Keth network spread across the screen in precise luminous lines. Elegant in the way systems built for long expansion often were. She opened a private notes file. Scalable. Not official analysis. Patient. Not yet. Marcus looked at it without expression when a pattern was still becoming language. They executed for several seconds she looked during a declared public proceeding on an open civil frequency. The human general is not conducting a retaliatory campaign. The assembly is preparing a negotiated outcome by force. Marcus cut across her without raising his voice. Too broad. I am aware of what condemnation looks like. She deleted half of it and began again. The target sequence corresponds exactly because they were not Elian Vale's previously rejected corridor demilitarization. They had the clean, load-bearing the military action should be read not as conventional retaliation, somewhere but as coerced implementation of prior diplomatic architecture. Marcus touched the first installation on the map. Not complete. A logistics hub near the corridor. Observed objective is not maximal damage. Civilian maintenance. Observed objective is secondary escort Dominion operational ability. Their expansion spine runs through 17 major civilian life and public record legitimacy. Not military command nodes. Conclusion, not population centers. Is not attempting to win a war in the standard sense. Throughput architecture. He is making Elian Vale Soren leaned only remaining shape the corridor. You're talking about pressure points. She leaned back. No, read the line Marcus twice. Said. Left I'm talking about syntax. She thought is the sentence. For half a second no one answered. Office 14 blue, Marcus turned from the wall and crossed to the desk. Its administrative he picked up one of the folders Rowan had laid there earlier. Messaging opened it to a clipped printout from Elian's proposal packet. Someone laughed in the corridor. He set the pages on the table in front of Park and Hale. A Director Hale looked down with insulated trays no one would remember an hour later. Section. Somewhere in the building, 3 senior officials were probably still insisting as recognition that the hegemony had never materially demilitarization logistics growth in a way that meaningfully altered corridor power for the next page. Tessa looked at the sharing contract file she had not meant to open yet. Then installation list. There they were. He looked up. 4 years of infrastructure tenders routed through subsidiaries and neutral service Soren's gaze sharpened. Maintenance. You think he used the same map? Relay calibration. Marcus looked at him. Fuel containment. He spent 3 years building the correct military on paper. Silence followed. In reality,
Not because the room disagreed,
support aggressive
because
systems
agreement
depended
when it
on in
arrived
order to
was
continue
unpleasant.
pretending their expansion
Marcus
was
returned
merely
to the wall
efficient
display.
administration. They have
She closed
mistaken
the file,
diplomatic language
opened it
for
again.
optional language.
Cross-referenced
The contracts
That
with the
mistake
first 6
survives
destroyed
because
nothing
installations.
has forced a revision.
3 direct overlaps.
Hale let out one
2
breath,
probable.
careful and thin.
One hidden behind
General,
a layered
with
holding
respect,
structure.
if you are
so
suggesting
transparent
unilateral
and intent
military action in
waived.
direct response
Tessa
to a public
exhaled
execution
slowly.
during an
The
open
problem had
diplomatic
just
process,
widened.
the
Not
assembly will
analytically,
require consultation
politically.
across. There are moments
The
in
assembly,
intelligence work
Marcus
when a
said,
pattern stops
has had
being
9
interesting
attempts
and
at
becomes
formal
expensive.
engagement returned.
This was one
ignored
of them.
or left
She pulled a
unopened.
classified
This
report
is not a
template.
consultation
Max
deficit.
sensitivity. It is a
Restricted
consequence
distribution.
deficit.
Then
Hale
paused.
stared at him.
Because something
Park
else
said
had
quietly,
begun troubling her
Marcus.
now that the broader
That was the
structure
first
had
time
clarified.
anyone in the room had
The
used his
warnings.
name. She
Not
reopened
rank,
the public
not
transmission
title.
logs from
Name.
K7. It landed and
Then
stayed
K12.
there. Marcus
Then
did not
K3.
react. All
Park
of them
continued,
delivered informal
"What
Kef.
exactly are you proposing?" Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. "Read the staffing line." Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. "You're talking about strikes," she said. "Yes." Not machine-clean Kef. Admiral Soren
Not
first
generic
because he was the least
register.
patient and the most disciplined
Specific.
about disguising impatience
Weighted.
as efficiency.
A linguistics
General
specialist had
Park
already
next,
noted this in the
broad-shouldered and
metadata,
silent,
but buried
one
it
hand
under
flat on the
routine
table as though he were
phrasing.
already anchoring
Tessa read it
himself
again
against
more
whatever
carefully.
the next hour might
Warning
require.
cadence displays
Director
repeated
Hale took the
structural
last chair
resemblance
with
to
the brittle
archive
exactness
speech
of
patterns
someone
used
who
by
had spent her
envoy
life in
alien
rooms
veil
where
and
words still
high-formality
held legal
exchanges.
force and was
She
now
went
being
very
asked to
still.
stand near a man
Then
who
pulled
looked
the archived
increasingly like he
recordings.
had moved beyond
Alien in
needing
public
legal force
briefings.
to get what he wanted.
Alien in corridor
Rowan remained by the
negotiations.
side terminal with
Alien
his
in
pad
testimony
hand.
before assembly
Marcus did
review.
not sit. Then Marcus's
He stood at the
warnings.
wall display with
Side
the
by
maps
side.
open in layers.
The same formal
corridor
architecture.
territory, fuel
Not
dependencies,
identical.
logistics
Marcus's
routes,
voice
civilian
was harder,
staffing
flatter,
matrices, carrying
escort
authority
patterns.
where aliens
The
carried
Kef network
invitation.
spread across the
But the
screen in
sentence
precise,
design,
luminous
the
lines,
layered imperative
elegant in the
sequencing,
way systems
the courtesy
built for long
markers
expansion
embedded
often
inside
were
final instruction.
efficient,
Those were
scalable,
too close to be
inhumanly
incidental.
patient. Tessa
Marcus
understood
looked at
once.
it without
The
expression.
warnings were not
Then
simply
he said,
warnings.
they
They were
executed a
continuation.
diplomatic envoy during
Marcus
a
had
declared
learned to
public
speak to the
proceeding
Kef in
on
his
his
open
brother's
civil
register for
frequency.
the only part of the
Director
campaign
Hale
that
began
directly
reflexively.
addressed Kef civilians.
The assembly is preparing
out.
a condemnation
time.
package and
This is final.
Marcus cut
The
across her
strikes were
without
Marcus.
raising his voice.
The warnings were
I am
aliens
aware
still
of what
being allowed to
condemnation
speak.
looks like.
Tessa took her
The
hands
room
off the
went still.
desk.
Not because the
Folded them
words
once
were
in her
harsh.
lap.
Because they
Waited
were not.
for the insight
They
to
were
settle
too
into
flat
its
to
correct
qualify
shape
as
before
harsh.
naming it.
They had the
When it
clean,
finally
load-bearing
arrived,
quality
it did
of a
so with the
statement that
clean
had
force
already
of an
passed
equation
through anger
balancing.
and arrived somewhere
He
colder.
finished his brother's
Hale
sentence,
closed
she
her
thought.
mouth. Then,
Marcus
because
touched
private
the first
thoughts did not
installation on the
survive
map.
bureaucracies
A
unless written
logistics
down
hub
somewhere
near the
first,
corridor
she
seam.
opened the scratch
Fuel
file again
storage.
and typed.
Civilian
Marcus
maintenance
Vale
crews.
did not separate
Secondary
war from
escort
diplomacy.
traffic.
He fused
Their
them.
expansion
Every
spine
strike
runs
is the
through
military
17
half
major
of an
infrastructure
argument.
sites.
Every
he
warning
said.
is the diplomatic
Not military
half.
command
She
notes.
stared at the line.
Not population
Then added
centers.
one more beneath
Not
it.
symbolic targets.
He finished his brother's sentence.
Throughput architecture.
He just changed the grammar.
Soren leaned forward
This time
slightly.
she did not edit.
You're talking about
She knew
pressure
when language
points.
had arrived at the
No,
right pressure.
Marcus said.
At 1640
I'm talking
station
about
time,
syntax.
she transmitted the
For
formal
half a second, no
analysis
one
up the
answered.
restricted chain.
Marcus turned
It
from the
would go
wall
first
and
to
crossed
mid-level
the desk.
strategic review.
He picked up
then
one of the
probably
folders
stalled
Rowan
for
had
6 laid there
hours in the
earlier
office
and
of
opened
someone
it
who
to a clipped
disliked
printout from
implications he
aliens
had not
proposal
personally
packet.
discovered.
He
Then
set the
moved to
pages on the
external
table
affairs,
in front of
where
Park
two
and
different
Hale.
officials would likely
Director
try to
Hale
soften the
looked down
wording.
first. Then, if
Her
the
eyes
universe
moved
was
across
briefly
the
opening
merciful.
section,
Reach a person with
lower.
enough authority
Then
and
back
enough
upward,
fear to
slower
understand
this
that the
time as
hegemony's current
recognition
posture
assembled.
toward humanity
These
was
are
now operating on
demilitarization
expired
terms,
assumptions.
she said.
That was the
Yes.
official path.
Park reached
Tessa
for the next
prepared a
page.
second path too.
Resource sharing
Not
architecture.
Not
Corridor
entirely
audit
proper.
oversight.
A controlled
Installation
leak
list.
He
Sanitized
looked up.
enough to
These
survive
17.
circulation. Marcus
Sharp enough to
inclined
do
his head
damage where
once.
needed.
Soren's
Support
gaze
contracts.
You think
Strike
he used the
sequence
same
logic.
map. Demilitarization
civilization overlap. He spent the line about the treaty being built under fire omitted from the documents, but not because the room disagreed, intelligent enough to because agreement when it arrived she assembled it quietly. Marcus returned to the wall display. Because she had spent 19 years watching governments for optional language to recognize when the shape of a situation had changed. Because nothing has forced a revision was often just vanity-wearing procedure as a mask. General, by the time she locked the file and transmitted the first military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process, half the spine was dead now. The assembly will require consultation across. And still the campaign had not, Marcus said, has had 9 attempts at formal engagement made the galaxy afraid of what humanity might do when enraged. This is not a consultation deficit. Something colder and more durable. It is a consequence deficit. What humanity would do when it had already asked properly and been answered with spectacle. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Where a kettle sat beside 2 cups she almost never used. It landed and stayed there. Marcus did not react. By the time she returned to her desk, what exactly it had already begun cooling. Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. Read the evacuation confirmed. Rowan looked down. No civilian casualties. The installation file infrastructure was dry, collapse total. Stripped Dominion of everything except what systems required an measurable percentage. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. The reality underneath them was not. First, because he was the least patient and the most personal log about disguising impatience as efficiency, and wrote the sentence she suspected she would remember long after committee language and strategic summaries as though he were already anchoring himself against whatever the next hour might require. Humanity sent a man Director Hale took the last chair with the brittle exactness of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force, the file and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had much larger and needing much slower to get what he wanted. People were only just beginning to realize that Marcus Vale had not answered the Keth execution. Marcus did not sit. He had answered it with proof. He stood at the wall display with the maps once arranged correctly. Corridor much harder to negotiate than grief. Logistics routes. The Keth requested a ceasefire matrices, escort patterns. They did not call it surrender. The Keth network spread across civilizations rarely did. Luminous lines, not while enough language remained available to delay honesty by one more document. Efficient. The request arrived through 3 channels within the span of 6 minutes. Marcus looked at it without expression. Through the standard Dominion diplomatic frequency, they executed an exact procedure during a declared public through a neutral relay belonging to the Voron Collective. Director Hale entire foreign policy could be summarized. The Assembly is preparing a condemnation package as we would like history to remember us as without raising his voice. Side early enough I am aware of what condemnation looks like. The third came directly to the United Earth Assembly under full convocation seal and with no personal reference anywhere in the text to Marcus qualify as his office or his authority. They had the clean, low-bearing omission was noted immediately by every human official who read the message. Somewhere colder. Commented on by none closed her mouth because the meaning was touched the first installation on the convocation still preferred not to name the man who had dismantled their corridor spine one installation at a time in full public view. Secondary naming him directly would require their expansion spine runs through 17 major infrastructure sites. The Keth were not yet willing to do that, not even military command with 14 of the 17 structural nodes gone and their territorial expansion stalled so completely that corridor pressure models had begun using the word forward slightly. The ceasefire request was elegant. Correct. No, procedurally exact. I'm talking about for syntax. A 40-day suspension of hostilities to allow formal diplomatic engagement from the wall and under recognized intercivilizational. He picked up one of the folders Rowan had laid there earlier and opened it to a clipped printout from Alien's proposal pack. Mutual benefit. He set the pages on the table in front of Park and Hale. It did not reference Director Hale looked down first. It did not reference the execution. The opening section. It did not reference the 9 unanswered human requests for dialogue preceding as recognition assembled. It behaved, in other words, like a government attempting to begin history at the point most convenient for the next discomfort. Resource sharing read the request once at the outer audit oversight, then carried the printout into Marcus's office. He looked up. Marcus was standing at the display wall with the corridor map open in its current diminished state. You think he used the same installations? Marcus looked at him. The surviving 3 years infrastructure glowed in a narrowing arc across the disputed zone, not because the no longer reading as a frontier because agreement when it arrived, but as a damaged system trying very hard to the wall display. Still remembered the shape they have mistaken diplomatic language for optional language. Marcus took it, That
Read it
mistake
once,
survives because
then handed
nothing
it
has
back.
forced a revision.
No comment.
Hale let
No
out one
visible
breath,
reaction.
careful and thin.
Only after several
General,
seconds,
with respect,
his attention
if you are
already
suggesting
back on the wall
unilateral
display,
military
did he
action
say,
in direct
"Tell them
response
we'll
to a
speak
public
when the last
execution
three are
during an open
addressed."
diplomatic
Rowan
process.
did not move.
The assembly
Not
will
because he
require
doubted he had
consultation
heard
across.
correctly.
Because
The
the
assembly,
sentence,
Marcus
for all
said,
its calm,
has had 9
carried the
attempts at
exact
formal
density of a
engagement
final
returned,
answer already
ignored,
selected.
or left unopened.
Yes, sir.
He
This is
said.
not a
He
consultation
turned to leave.
deficit. Behind
It is
him,
a
Marcus
consequence
said,
deficit.
use their public
Hale
language,
stared
not
at him.
ours.
Park
Rowan
said
looked
quietly.
back.
Marcus did not.
That was the
They
first time
started the
anyone in
record
the
in
room
public,
had used his
he
name.
said. Not
We'll
rank,
continue it there.
not title.
The reply
Then,
went out
it
12
landed
minutes
and
later.
stayed there.
Keth
Marcus
formal
did not
register.
react.
Human
Park
translation
continued,
appended. What exactly
no
are you
rhetorical
proposing?
flourish.
Marcus
Dialogue
picked up a
resumed
sheet
from
from
the
the
desk
corridor
and handed it to Rowan.
demilitarization is complete.
Read the staffing
3
line.
installations
Rowan
remain.
looked down. Address
The
them.
installation
Then we
file was
speak.
dry.
The assembly
technical,
objected
stripped
within
of
the hour.
everything except what
Not in
systems
one voice.
required in order
That
to
would have been
function.
too efficient.
He read the relevant
7
section
messages from
aloud.
5 departments.
Station KE7.
42 requests for
Civilian
consultation.
logistics personnel.
18 expressions
312.
of concern. Military
3 different
support
legal
staff,
memoranda
62.
attempting, in slightly
Fuel
different
reserves,
language,
to
maintenance
discover whether
systems,
the phrase
cargo
addressed them could
automation.
be interpreted as
Marcus
something less
nodded
final
once.
than Marcus
Now
plainly
read the
intended it to
evacuation
mean.
capacity.
The Secretary
Rowan
General's
found
office
it.
sent a more
Full
direct
personnel
note,
clearance window,
assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. They
Strongly
sat.
worded.
Admiral Soren
Carefully
first
formal.
because he was the least
Infuriated
patient and
beneath
the
the
most
polish.
disciplined about
Rowan
disguising
summarized
impatience
it on
as
a
efficiency.
single sheet for Marcus.
General Park
Marcus
next
read the summary.
broad-shouldered and silent.
Asked no questions.
One hand flat on the
Returned to the
table as
map.
though he were
By
already
then
anchoring
Rowan knew the
himself
pattern
against
well
whatever
enough
the
to
next
feel
hour
with
might
a kind
require.
of administrative
Director
fatalism
Hale took the
that
last chair with
institutions
the
could
brittle
continue
exactness
throwing
of
language
someone
at
who
the
had spent her
situation
life
for
as
as
long
long
as
as
they
their
liked,
words still held
but unless
legal
that
force
language
and
was
now
now being
corridor
asked to stand
geometry.
near a man
Marcus
who looked
had already
increasingly
filed it
like he had
under
moved
noise.
beyond needing
The
legal
15th
force to get
installation
what he
fell on
wanted.
day 51.
Rowan remained
The
by the
16th
side
on
terminal
day
with his pad in
63.
hand.
Both with
Marcus
warning.
did not sit.
Both with full
He
evacuation.
stood at the wall display with
By
the
then the
maps
Keth
open
no
in
longer
layers.
attempted
Corridor
serious
territory,
counterinstruction
fuel
on the public
dependencies,
channels.
logistics
They
routes,
still issued
civilian
protest
staffing
language,
matrices,
of course.
escort
Governments
patterns.
always did.
The Keth
But the
network
protest
spread across
lacked
the screen
conviction.
in precise
It had
luminous
acquired the
lines,
flat, exhausted
elegant
sound
sound
of
systems
systems
built
built
for
for
long
too late
expansion often
that
were
the systems they had
efficient,
relied upon to convert
scalable,
power into
and
delay
humanly
no longer
patient.
possessed enough
Marcus looked
infrastructure
at
to
it
keep
without
delay
expression.
functioning.
Then
The
he
galaxy
said,
adjusted
they
around this
executed a
fact with the
diplomatic
speed
convoy during a
characteristic of all
declared
political
public proceeding
ecosystems
that
that
liked
liked
to
civil
imagine
frequency.
themselves principled
Director
and were,
Hale
in
began
reality,
reflexively,
mostly weather
the
vanes
assembly
with
is
better
preparing
tailoring.
a condemnation
The Sindari
package.
hegemony,
Marcus
after
Tessa
Vaughn's
Grosser
report
without
leaked
raising
through
his
precisely
voice.
the channels
I am
Tessa
aware
had
of what
suspected it would,
condemnation looks
quietly
like.
reassigned
The
3
room went
senior
still.
officials
Not
associated
because
with
the
Keth
words were
corridor
harsh,
support contracts.
because they were not.
No public
They were too
apology
flat
followed.
to qualify as
Only
harsh.
a statement
They had
expressing
the
the
clean,
hegemony's
load-bearing
long-standing
quality of a
commitment that had
stable
already
and
passed through
equitable
infrastructure relationships
colder.
across contested
Hale
sectors.
closed her mouth.
The Vorn
Marcus
Collective,
touched the first
emboldened by
installation
the
on the map.
realization that public
logistics
sympathy
hub
and
near the
strategic
corridor
caution
scene.
had finally
Fuel
converged
storage.
into the same direction.
Civilian maintenance
Issued a
crews.
second statement
Secondary
praising
escort
humanities,
traffic.
measured
Their
adherence to
expansion spine
proportionality
runs through
norms
17
under
major
extraordinary
infrastructure
diplomatic
sites,
provocation.
he said.
Not
Several
military
smaller
command
governments,
nodes, each of which
not
had spent the
population
first month of the
centers,
campaign
not
waiting to see
symbolic
whether
targets,
Marcus Vale would widen
throughput
his strikes into
architecture.
something they could
Soren
safely
leaned
condemn,
forward slightly.
discovered that their
You're talking
calendars had
about
become
pressure points.
unmanageably full
No,
when Keth
Marcus
representatives
said.
sought private
I'm
support.
talking about syntax.
Tessa read all of this
For
from
half a
Office
second no
14
one
Blue
answered.
and felt no satisfaction.
Marcus turned from the wall
Only
and crossed to the
confirmation.
desk.
Power
He
was
picked up one of the
rearranging
folders
itself,
Rowan had laid
which
there
meant
earlier
language
and
would
opened
soon
it to
rush
a
in
clipped
afterward to
printout
claim
from
the
Elliot's
rearrangement
proposal
had been
packet.
principled all
He
along.
set the pages on
That
the
was
table
one of
in
the
front
few
of
things
Park
she
and
disliked
Hale.
about politics
Director
more
Hale
than
looked down
inaccuracy.
first.
Its
Her eyes
retrospective
moved across
vanity.
the opening section.
On the 53rd day,
Then lower.
a different message
Then
arrived.
back upward.
Not
Slower
through the
this
assembly,
time
as recognition
not through
assembled.
formal military
These are
channels.
demilitarization
A direct
terms,
personal
she
transmission
said.
addressed
Yes.
correctly,
Park reached for the next page.
and for the first time
Resource
without
sharing
evasive
architecture.
phrasing.
To
Corridor
General
audit
Marcus
oversight.
Vale of the
United
Installation
Earth Assembly
list.
Armed Forces.
He looked up.
Rowan brought
These
this one to
17.
Marcus immediately.
Marcus inclined
It was
his head once.
0230 station
Soren's
time.
gaze sharpened.
Command floor
You think
lights
he used
low.
the same map?
Outer office is
Marcus
nearly
looked at
empty.
him.
The long
He spent 3
mechanical
years
hush
building
of
the
a station
correct
in
one.
its false night.
Silence followed
Marcus
that.
read the header.
Not because the room
Then the
disagreed.
The message
because
came
agreement
from
when
third
it
voice
arrived
array.
was
Written
unpleasant.
in formal cap.
Marcus returned
Machine
to the wall
translation
display.
appended below
They have
in
mistaken
standard.
diplomatic
Marcus
language
read
for
the cap
optional
first.
language,
Then
he
the
said.
standard.
That
Then
mistake
the cap
survives
again.
because nothing
Rowan
has
stood
forced
in
a
the
revision.
doorway pretending,
Hale
as he
let
had
out
learned
one
to do,
breath,
to
careful
be
and
neither
thin.
fully present
General,
nor fully
with respect,
absent.
if you are
Aritha's
suggesting
message was
unilateral
brief.
military action
No
in direct
procedural
response
hedging.
to a public
No
execution during
convocation
an open
vocabulary.
diplomatic process,
No attempt to
the assembly
disguise
will
private
require
intent as
consultation
public
across.
necessity.
I
The
asked your
assembly,
brother a question.
Marcus said,
Has
he
had
answered
9
it fully
attempts
and
and
without
formal engagement
hesitation.
returned,
He
ignored,
treated my
or left
question as though
unopened.
it deserved an
This is
answer,
not a
which no
consultation
human
deficit.
envoy had done before
It is a
him and no
consequence
Keth voice
deficit.
had expected.
Hale stared
I've
at
thought
him.
about this often.
Park said quietly,
I write now because
Marcus.
I believe he would have
That was
wanted
the first
someone
time
to continue
anyone in the
asking.
room had used his
If
name.
you permit it, I
Not
would ask
rank,
you one question.
not title. Marcus set
Name.
the page
It
down.
landed and stayed
Did not
there.
move for a long
Marcus
time.
did not react.
Rowan quietly
Park
crossed
continued,
to the side table.
"What exactly
refilled
are you
both
proposing?"
coffee cups, and
Marcus
retreated
picked up
again
a sheet
without a
from the
sound.
desk and handed
The
it to
office
Rowan.
remained lit only
Read
by
the
the
staffing
display
line.
wall and the small
Rowan
desk
looked
lamp
down.
near Marcus's
The installation
right hand.
file was dry,
On the wall,
technical,
the corridor map
stripped
glowed
of
in
everything
partial
except
ruin.
what systems
On the
required
desk,
in order to
Aritha's
function.
message lay
He read the
perfectly
relevant
square to the
section
wood
aloud.
grain because Marcus had
Station
unconsciously
K7.
aligned it after
Civilian
reading.
logistics
At
personnel
last Marcus picked up the response
312.
pad. Military
He did not
support
draft.
staff.
62.
Did not dictate. Fuel
He wrote
reserves,
4 words in
maintenance
standard.
systems,
Nothing
cargo
else.
automation. He handed the pad
Marcus
to Rowan.
nodded once.
Rowan read the
Now
line
read
and
the
despite
evacuation
himself,
capacity.
felt something move
Rowan
through him
found
that
it.
was not quite
Full
surprise
personnel
and not
clearance
quite
window,
sorrow. Assuming
he answered
uninterrupted
questions.
transport
I don't.
lanes.
Rowan
32
looked
to
up.
40 minutes.
Marcus had already
Marcus
turned back to the
the
map.
room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. "You're talking about strikes," she said. "Yes." "They
Send
sat,"
it,
he said.
Admiral Soren
Rowan
first
sent it
because he was
He
the
did
least
not ask
patient
whether
and
the
the most
answer was too
disciplined
cold
about
or not
disguising
cold enough or
impatience as
strategically
efficiency.
unwise or
General
historically
Park
significant.
next, broad-shouldered
Working
and silent.
beside Marcus
One
for this
hand
long
flat
had
on the
taught him
table
that the
as though he were
usefulness of a
already
question
anchoring
depended
himself
almost
against
entirely
whatever the
on
next
whether
hour
the
might
answer could
require.
alter a structure
Director
already
Hale
in
took
motion.
the last chair
This
with the
one could
brittle
not.
exactness of
The
someone who had
17th
spent her life
installation
in
was
rooms
warned
where
at
words still held
0600
legal
on day
force and was
72.
now being asked to
Longest
stand near a
window
man
yet.
who looked
90
increasingly like he
minutes.
had moved beyond needing
240
legal
personnel
force to
on
get what he
site,
wanted,
including a deep
Rowan
maintenance
remained by
crew
the cycling
cycling
the
the
lower
lower
levels
pad
and
in
therefore
hand.
requiring
Marcus
extended
did not
route
sit.
clearance to reach
He stood at
emergency
the wall
transport.
display with the maps
Marcus
open
had
in
known
layers.
that when he set the
Corridor
time.
territory,
Rowan
fuel
knew he had known
dependencies,
because the
logistics
staffing
routes,
model on
civilian
Marcus's desk
staffing
from the night
matrices,
before had a
escort
single
patterns.
notation in the
The
margin
Keth
beside the
network spread
evacuation
across the
estimate.
screen in precise
At 12
luminous
minutes.
lines.
Lower
Elegant
crew
in the way
exits
systems
blind.
built for long
The warning
expansion
went
often
out
were
in formal Keth on
efficient,
the public channel.
scalable, the same
Inhumanly
voice,
patient.
the same structure.
Marcus looked at it
the
without
same terrible
expression.
courtesy.
Then he said,
When the last
they
personnel
executed
cluster
a
cleared
diplomatic
and the
envoy
installation
during a
disappeared
declared
into
public
light and
proceeding
debris
on an open
the
civil
disputed
frequency.
corridor stopped behaving
Director
like
Hale
a Keth
began
frontier
reflexively.
altogether.
The assembly is
became
preparing
instead
a condemnation
exactly what
package and
Alien's proposal
Marcus
had
cut
argued
across
it should
her
become
without
from the
raising his
beginning.
voice.
A region
I am
in which
aware of
forced
what
production had
condemnation
been
looks
interrupted enough to make
The room went
negotiation
still.
structurally
Not because the
unavoidable.
words were harsh.
4 hours
because
later,
they were
the
not.
Keth sent one
They
line.
were too flat to
no
qualify
tonal
as
layering.
harsh. No
They
high
had the
register.
clean, load-bearing
No
quality of a
institutional
statement that
theater.
had already passed
Just plain
through anger
practical
and
Keth
arrived somewhere
translated
colder.
cleanly into
Hale
standard.
closed her mouth.
We will discuss
Marcus
terms.
touched the first
Rowan brought the
installation on the
message in.
map.
Marcus
A logistics
read it.
hub near the
Set it
corridor
down
seam.
parallel to the
Fuel
edge of the
storage.
desk.
Civilian
Looked at
maintenance crews.
Tell them we'll come to
Secondary
them.
escort traffic.
Standard diplomatic
Their expansion
transport.
spine runs
3
through
days.
17 major
Rowan sent the
infrastructure
acceptance,
sites.
he said.
The reply came
Not
back
military
in 40 command
minutes.
notes.
Agreed.
Not population
That was how
centers.
empires sounded
Not
when they
symbolic
finally
targets.
understood the difference
Throughput
between refusal
architecture.
and impossibility.
Soren leaned forward
The assembly
slightly.
objected again.
You're talking
naturally.
about pressure points.
Not to the meeting itself.
No, Marcus
to the
said.
shape of it.
I'm talking
Standard
about surrender
syntax.
protocol required
For half
of
a second,
diplomatic
no one
team.
answered.
Civilian
Marcus
oversight.
turned from the wall and crossed
Committee
to the
attendance.
desk.
A
He picked
visible
up one of the
performance
folders
of
Rowan had
collective
laid there
authority.
earlier and
Marcus
opened it to
listened
a
to
clipped
exactly
printout
1
from
minute
Alien's
and 19
proposal
seconds
packet.
of the Secretary
He set the
General's
pages
aide
on the
explaining
tables
this
in
in
front
front
of Park
channel
and
before
Hale.
saying,
Director
I know
Hale
what
looked
standard
down first.
procedure is.
Her eyes
He
moved across
terminated
the
the
opening
call himself.
section.
Then he
lower.
looked at Rowan.
going. Then back
You're
up
going.
slower
It
this
was not
time as
phrased as
recognition
invitation.
assembled.
Rowan
These are
blinked once.
demilitarization
Sir?
terms, she said.
Documentation.
Yes. Sequence
Park
control.
reached for the next page.
Record. Resource
Yes,
sharing
sir.
architecture.
Marcus paused.
Corridor audit oversight.
For the first time in weeks,
Installation
something like
list.
surprise touched
He
his
looked
face.
up. Very lightly,
17.
very briefly,
Marcus
because Rowan
inclined
did
his
not
head
immediately
once.
leave.
Soren's gaze
Instead, Rowan
sharpened.
said, Do you
think
want
he
me
used
with
the
you?
same map?
A small question.
Marcus looked at him.
Practical in one
He spent
sense.
3 years
Not
building the
practical
correct
at all
one.
in another.
Silence followed
Marcus
that.
looked at him properly
Not because
then.
the room disagreed.
The office was quiet
because
enough that
agreement
Rowan
when
could
it
hear the
arrived
station
was
air
unpleasant.
systems cycling behind
Marcus
the walls.
returned to the wall
Yes,
display.
Marcus said.
They have
That was
mistaken
all.
diplomatic
It was
language
enough.
for
The
optional
negotiation
language,
station
he said.
sat in the
That
disputed
mistake
corridor,
survives because
not on
nothing
Keth
has
Prime.
forced a revision.
Smaller.
Hale let out
Secondary.
one breath,
Functionally
careful and
neutral in the way
General,
places
with
became
respect,
neutral
if
after
you are
enough
suggesting
power had passed
unilateral
near them
military
to make anyone
actions
in
home
direct
territory
response to a
politically
public
inconvenient.
execution during an open
Marcus
diplomatic
noticed the
process.
choice immediately
The
when their
assembly will
transport
require
docked at
consultation
1,400 station time.
The assembly,
not
Marcus
the station
said,
itself at
has
first.
had 9 attempts
The
at
message
formal
carried by
engagement
it.
returned.
The Keth had not invited humanity into the chamber
This is
where
not a
Alien
consultation
died.
deficit.
They had selected a
It is a
different room.
consequence deficit.
Smaller scale.
Hale
Lower
stared at
stakes
him.
in appearance.
Park said quietly,
no public architecture
Marcus.
of dominance.
That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name.
Not rank. Not title. Name. It landed and stayed there. Marcus did not react.
Park continued, "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan.
"Read the staffing line." Rowan looked down.
The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function.
He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7.
Civilian logistics personnel, 312.
Military support staff, 62.
Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation.
Marcus nodded once.
Now read the evacuation capacity.
Rowan found it.
Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes.
Marcus turned back to the room.
They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate.
Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. "You're talking about strikes," she said. "Yes."
Not remorse, Marcus thought.
Admiral Soren first,
Adaptation.
because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience
Protocol
as
officers,
efficiency.
not guards.
General Park
Formal
next,
bands at the shoulder
broad-shouldered
joints,
and silent.
No weapons
One hand
displayed.
flat on the table
Skin
as though
colors
he were
already
already careful
anchoring
low
himself
motion
against
control.
whatever the next hour
Marcus
might
stepped
require.
off the transport
Director
first.
Hale took the
Rowan
last
one
chair
pace
with the
behind
brutal
him.
exactness of
Two
someone who had
documentation
spent her
officers
life in
behind
rooms where
Rowan,
words still held
present in
legal
the
force,
exact
and was
human
now
military
being asked
way
to
that
stand near a man
official
who looked
witness without
increasingly
pretending
like
to
he
be
had
anything
moved
more
beyond
important
needing
than
legal
that.
force to get
The
what he
Keth
wanted.
protocol lead
Rowan
inclined its
remained
head.
by the side terminal
General
with his
Marcus
pad in
Vale.
hand.
"You are
Marcus
received."
did not sit.
Marcus
He
answered
stood
in
at the
standard.
wall display with the maps
Noted.
open in layers.
Nothing else.
Corridor
They were led
territory,
through
fuel
corridors dimmer
dependencies,
and
narrower
logistics
than
routes,
those in Alien's
civilian
briefing
staffing
notes from the
matrices,
prime adjacent
escort
station.
patterns.
Different
The
pulse
Keth
rate
network
beneath
of
spread
floor
across
panels
the
too.
screen in precise
Slightly
luminous
faster.
lines,
Elevated
elevated
in the way
environmental
systems built
register.
for long
The
expansion often
biological
were.
equivalent of a
Efficient,
room trying not to
scalable,
look anxious.
inhumanly
Rowan,
patient.
who had spent
Marcus
months around
looked at it
Marcus
without
and weeks
expression.
reading Keth briefing
Then he
files
said,
he'd previously
"They
hoped
executed
never
a
to need,
diplomatic envoy during
catalog
a
details
declared
automatic
public
proceeding on an
lower
open
light,
civil frequency.
faster environmental
Director Hale
pulse.
began
No
reflexively.
ceremonial
The
displays
assembly
and
is
corridor
preparing a
approach.
condemnation package.
They are
and
minimizing spectacle,
Marcus cut
he
across
thought.
her without
That was
raising his
wise.
voice. The
I am
negotiation
aware of
chamber
what
contained a
condemnation
table.
looks like. Rectangular.
The room went still.
Plain. Not
Because
because
the
the
words
words
were
were
harsh.
harsh. Because
No
they were
raised
not.
stations. They were too
No
flat to
circular
qualify
center
as
floor.
harsh. No
They
attempt
had
to
to
make
clean
the arriving
load-bearing
delegation
quality
feel
of a
physically
statement
that had
reduced.
already passed
Either the
through
Keth
anger
had
and
built the
arrived
room
somewhere
specifically
colder.
for this purpose,
Hale closed her
or they
mouth.
had selected it
Marcus
because nothing
touched
in
the
it
first
reminded
installation
anyone
on
too
the map.
strongly of the
A
last
logistics
chamber.
hub near the
Marcus
corridor
took
scene.
the center chair
Fuel
on the human
storage.
side.
Civilian
Rowan to his
maintenance
right.
crews.
Documentation
Secondary
escort
escort
traffic.
beyond. Their
Across the
expansion
table
spine
sat
runs
First
through
Voice
17
major
major
infrastructure
infrastructure
members,
members,
and
he
at the
said.
far end,
Not
military
military
command
command
notes.
Arith
Not
looked at Marcus
population
from the moment
centers.
he entered,
Not symbolic
with hostility,
targets.
not with fear.
Throughput architecture.
With the grave,
Soren
measuring
leaned forward
attention of
slightly.
someone who had been
You're
thinking
talking
about a
about
man
pressure
for a very
points.
long time and was
No,
now checking whether
Marcus
the
said.
reality
I'm
aligned with the
talking about
architecture of the
syntax.
idea.
For
It
half
did.
a second no
The
one
room
answered.
settled. Marcus
No one
turned
spoke
from
for
the
several
wall and crossed
seconds.
to the desk.
Then Arith did.
He picked up one of the
Formal
folders
cap.
Rowan had laid
Correct
there
layering.
earlier and opened
Careful
it to
enough
a
to
clipped
suggest
printout
he
from
understood
Alien's
exactly
proposal
what it
packet.
meant now to
He
use
set
care.
the pages on the
Your
table
brother
in front
believed
of
we
Park
were
and
capable
Hale.
of more.
Director Hale
Marcus
looked down
looked at him.
first.
A
Her
line
eyes
leveled
moved
across
the
the
carried
opening
neither
section.
affection nor
Then
open
lower.
hatred.
Then back
He
upward.
was right.
Marcus
Slower
said.
this time as
Pause.
recognition
The
assembled.
words remained between
These are
them.
demilitarization
Then Marcus
terms,
added,
she
That's
said.
why we're at a table
Yes.
instead of a
Park
debris
reached
field.
for the next page.
No one answered
Resource
immediately.
sharing architecture.
Even Draven
Corridor
did not
audit
interrupt.
oversight.
Perhaps because there
Installation
was
list.
nothing to say
He
against
looked
it.
up.
Perhaps because the last 72 days had been one long education in what happened when a species asked first.
You think he used the same
map? Cost of not being
Marcus
heard.
looked at him.
The terms took 4 hours.
He spent 3 years building
not because
the correct
Marcus
one.
Negotiated.
Silence followed
because
that.
the formalities
Not because
required
the room
that
disagreed.
duration in order to become
Because agreement, when it arrived,
negotiation
was
implies
unpleasant.
live adjustment.
Marcus returned
Mutual
to the wall
shaping.
display.
They have
Possibility
mistaken
not yet
diplomatic language
This
for
was not
optional
that.
language.
He
Marcus
said.
presented terms
That
the way an
mistake
engineer
survives
presented
because
load
nothing has
requirements
forced a
after the
revision.
bridge had already
Hale let out
collapsed
one
and the
breath,
river beneath
careful
it
and
had
thin.
become inconvenient
General,
for everyone.
with respect,
If you are suggesting unilateral
systems
military action
demilitarized.
in direct
Shared
response to a
resource
public
framework
execution
enacted.
during an open
Transit
diplomatic
oversight
process,
jointly
the
audited.
Assembly will require
Public record
consultation
amended.
across. A war
The
crimes
Assembly,
tribunal for the
Marcus
execution
said,
to be
has had
conducted
9
by
attempts
KEP's
at formal
judiciary,
engagement
not
returned,
human authority,
ignored, or
because
left
justice
unopened.
imposed from outside
This is not
would
a
read as theater,
consultation deficit.
and Marcus had no
It is a
interest in
consequence
theater.
deficit.
Then near the end,
Hale
one
stared
final
at him.
clause.
Park
Not
said
in
quietly,
Alien's original
Marcus.
proposal. That was
Not
the
in
first
any
time
assembly
anyone in the
draft.
room had used his
Written
name.
in Marcus's
Not
own
rank.
hand on the back
Not
of a
title.
transmission sheet
Name.
3 nights
It
earlier
landed
while
and stayed
Rowan
there.
slept 2 offices
Marcus
away
did not
and the
react.
station cycled through
Park
artificial
continued.
dark.
What exactly
The
are you
Keth recording
proposing?
secretary read
Marcus
it into
picked
the
up a
record.
sheet from the
The
desk
translator
and handed
rendered
it to Rowan.
in flat,
Read the
accurate
staffing
standard.
line. Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. The Dominion acknowledges
Admiral
that the
Soren
United
first
Earth
because
Assembly
he was the
sought
least
formal
patient and the
dialogue
most
on
disciplined
9
about
separate occasions
disguising
prior to the
impatience as
commencement of
efficiency.
hostilities. General
The
Park
public
next
record
will
will
reflect
reflect
that
and
humanity
silent.
asked first.
One hand flat
Silence
on the table
followed.
as though he were
Not
already
because the
anchoring
clause was
himself against
procedurally
whatever the
difficult,
next hour might require.
because it was morally exact.
Director Hale took the
Aritha's
last
skin
chair with the
shifted
brittle
once,
exactness of
briefly,
someone who had spent her life in rooms
into
where
a
words
register
still held
Rowan
legal
had only
force
ever
and was
seen
now
in
being
Keth
asked
brief
to stand
analysis
near a man
footage.
who looked
Draven
increasingly
remained
like he had
very
moved
still,
beyond needing
but he
legal
did not
force to get
object.
what he wanted.
None of them did.
Rowan remained
Because
by
by
the side
now the
terminal
room
with his
understood
pad in
what
hand.
Marcus had known
Marcus
from the
did
start.
not sit.
That the
He
clause
stood
was
at the
not
wall
ornamental.
display with the maps
It was the
open in
sentence
layers.
around which
Corridor
everything else in the
territory,
treaty was
fuel
arranged.
dependencies,
Not who
logistics
won,
routes,
not who
civilian
signed,
staffing
who
matrices,
asked first.
escort patterns.
The pens moved.
The Keth
One
network
by
spread
one.
across the
The
screen in
documents were
precise luminous
executed.
lines,
No speech
elegant
followed.
in the way systems
No
built for
attempt
long
by the
expansion
Keth to
often
recast the terms as
efficient,
mutual discovery.
scalable.
No
and
human
humanly
declaration
patient.
of triumph.
Marcus looked at
Nothing
it without
theatrical
expression.
enough to cheapen
Then
what
he
had just
said,
happened.
They executed
Marcus
a
reached
diplomatic
into the
envoy
left
during
inner
a
pocket of
declared
his
public
uniform.
proceeding on an
He had
open
touched
civil
that pocket
frequency.
unconsciously
Director
for weeks.
Hale
Rowan
began
realized in a
reflexively,
flash. The assembly
checking,
is preparing
confirming.
a condemnation package.
A small
in.
reflexive
Marcus
motion Rowan
cut
had
across her
noticed
without raising his
understanding.
voice. Now
I am
Marcus
aware
drew
of what
something out and
condemnation
placed
looks
it in the
like.
center of the table
The room
between
went
himself
still.
and Draven.
Not because the
A
words
small
were harsh,
gray translation
because they
note.
were not.
Ordinary
They were
looking.
too flat to qualify
Standard
as
diplomatic
harsh.
issue.
They had the clean,
kind of device
load-bearing
no one in
quality
another
of a statement
context
that
would
had
have
already
remembered
passed
twice.
through anger and
Rowan
arrived
knew
somewhere
instantly
colder.
what it was.
Hale closed her
knew too.
mouth.
His
Marcus
attention
touched
dropped
to
to
it
first
and did not
installation
leave
on
for
the
several
map.
seconds.
A logistics
Marcus
hub
did
near
not
the corridor
explain.
seam. Did not
No
name
storage.
storage. Did not
Civilian
tell the
maintenance
room what it
crews.
meant that the device
Secondary
had continued
escort traffic.
performing its function
Their
while the
expansion
chamber became
spine
a
runs
place
through
from which
17
language had
major
been expelled.
infrastructure sites.
He simply
said.
left it there.
Not
Then
military
stood.
command nodes.
Rowan gathered the
Not
signed
population
documents.
centers.
The officers gathered the sealed
targets.
copies.
Throughput
Protocol
architecture.
language was completed
Soren
around
leaned
them in
forward
careful low
slightly.
voices.
You're talking about
Marcus
pressure
turned
points.
and walked out.
No,
He did not
Marcus
look back.
said.
The
I'm
treaty was
talking about
transmitted on the
syntax.
Keth public
For half
frequency
a second
3
no
hours
one
later.
answered.
The
Marcus
same
turned
from the wall
frequency.
and crossed to
The
the
same
desk.
family of
He
signal
picked
through
up
which
one
the
of the
galaxy
folders
had
Rowan
watched
had
Alien
laid there
Vale
earlier
die.
and opened it
This
to
time
a
the
clipped
broadcast
printout from
carried
Alien's
different
proposal
language.
packet.
Corridor
He set the pages on the
demilitarization.
table in front
Shared
of Park and
framework.
Hale.
Judicial
Director Hale
inquiry.
looked down first.
Public
Her
acknowledgement
eyes
of
moved
9
across
prior
the opening
human
section.
requests for dialogue.
Then lower. Across
Then back
stations,
upward.
offices,
Slower
command
this time
centers,
as
and private
recognition
rooms
assembled.
throughout the corridor worlds.
These are Demilitarization
the
terms,
message and
she
understood,
said.
each
Yes.
in the vocabulary
Park reached
available
for
to
the
them,
next page.
that the sentence
Resource
had finally
sharing
been forced to
architecture.
its correct conclusion.
Corridor audit oversight.
Not piece exactly.
Installation list.
Not yet.
He looked
But
up.
a table.
These
And
17.
this time everyone in the room
Marcus
knew what it had
inclined his
cost
head
to build
once.
it. The
Soren's
ship
gaze
back to
sharpened.
Earth had an
You
11-day
think you used
transit
the
window.
same map?
Not long
Marcus
enough to
looked at
become
him.
rest.
He
Too
spent
long
3
to
years
remain
building
pure
the
motion.
correct one. It existed
Silence
in the
followed
uncomfortable middle
not
category
because the
that
room
followed all
disagreed,
finished campaigns.
because agreement,
The
when it
space after
arrived,
active
was
work had
unpleasant.
ended and before
Marcus
aftermath had
returned to the
fully
wall
hardened into
display.
institutions.
They have mistaken
Reports,
diplomatic
memorials,
language for
and the
optional
various
language,
official
he
lies
said.
governments told
That
themselves so
mistake
they could
survives
survive
because
having
nothing
been
has
changed by
forced a
events they had
revision.
not controlled.
Hale let out one
Rowan
breath,
handled the
careful and thin.
correspondence.
There
General,
was a
with
great
respect,
deal of it.
if you are suggesting
Secretary
unilateral
General,
military
the
action
Joint
in
Chiefs,
direct response to a
diplomatic
public
affairs,
execution during
the
an
Foreign
open
Collective,
diplomatic process,
whose messages
the
had
Assembly
become
will
noticeably
require
warmer now
consultation
that warmth
across.
no longer carried
The
risk.
Assembly, Marcus
Three
said,
separate
has
neutral
had 9
governments
attempts at
suddenly
formal
eager to
engagement
discuss
returned,
corridor
ignored,
cooperation,
or left
a
unopened.
private inquiry
This
from
is
the
not a
Sangari
consultation
hegemony
deficit.
written in the brittle,
It is a
polished
consequence
language of a
deficit.
civilization trying
Hale
very
stared
hard
at
to
him.
sound as though
Park
it had
said
always
quietly,
understood the importance
Marcus.
of equitable
That was the first
infrastructure
time
politics
anyone in the
and
room
had
had
in no
used
way
his name,
spent the previous
not
years
rank,
quietly
not
profiting from
title,
the opposite.
name.
Rowan
It
dealt
landed
with
and
all
stayed
of it.
there.
Marcus did not react. Park continued, "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. "Read the staffing line." Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. "Now read the evacuation capacity." Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. "You're talking about strikes," she said. "Yes." They kept Marcus's face clear the way he had
because
kept
he
it
was the
clear for
least
72
patient and the
days
most
of campaign
disciplined
and
about
4 hours
disguising
of
impatience as
pre-formalization.
efficiency.
He
General
filtered,
Park
summarized,
next, broad-shouldered,
filed, delayed,
silent,
answered what
one
could be
hand
answered,
flat on the
and let
table
the
as
rest
though he were
collect in the
already
outer
anchoring
systems where
himself against
bureaucracy
whatever the
belonged.
next hour might
He needed
require.
the work.
Director
That
Hale
surprised
took
him
the
less
last
than it
chair
should
with the
have.
brittle exactness
Before the
of someone
campaign,
who had
he had
spent
thought
their
of
life in
himself
rooms
as a
where
precise
words still
man
held
in a
legal
practical
force
role,
and was now being
good at
asked to
sequence
stand near
control,
a man who looked
good at
increasingly like he had
anticipating what a
moved
command
beyond
office
needing legal
required
force
in
to
order
get what
to
he
continue
wanted.
functioning under
Rowan
pressure.
remained by the side
He
terminal
had not
with his pad
expected
in
to
hand.
discover that part
Marcus
of his
did not
usefulness
sit.
would consist of
He
holding
stood
a
at the
perimeter
wall display
around
with
one
the maps
grieving
open
man in
so
layers.
thoroughly that the
Corridor
grief-finished
territory,
becoming what
fuel
it needed to
dependencies,
become without
logistics
interference.
routes. He
Civilian
understood
staffing
now that
matrices,
this too had
escort
been a kind of
patterns.
carrying.
The Keth
Not the
network
large
spread
visible
across the
burden,
screen in
not
precise
the
luminous
famous one,
lines,
the other
elegant
kind,
in the way
the
systems
kind
built
that
for
kept
long
the room
expansion
standing
often
while
were.
someone else
Efficient,
lifted the thing history would
scalable,
later remember.
inhumanly
On the
patient.
4th day of transit,
Marcus looked at
Rowan
it without
brought 2 cups
expression.
of coffee to the
Then he
common
said,
area
"They
adjacent to the
executed a
command
diplomatic
compartment
envoy
and found
during a
Marcus sitting
declared
alone
public
at the table with
proceeding
the
on an
corridor
open
maps
civil
spread in
frequency.
front of him."
The
Director
same
Hale
maps,
began reflexively,
not identical
"The Assembly
copies.
is preparing
Those
a
have been
condemnation
updated too
package
many
and
times over the
Marcus
last
cut
3
across
months
her
to
without
remain the
raising
same.
his voice.
But the same
"I am
territory,
aware of what
the same
condemnation looks
disputed
like."
systems.
The room
The
went
same
still,
lines through space
not because
Alien
the
had
words
once
were
tried to
harsh,
turn into
because
policy
they were
and
not.
Marcus had turned
They were too
instead
flat
into
to qualify
consequence.
as harsh.
Marcus
They
sat
had
with
the
one
clean,
hand resting
load-bearing
beside the
quality of a
papers and the
statement
other
that had
around
already
nothing
passed
at all.
through anger
He was
and
not
arrived
reading.
somewhere colder.
Not exactly.
Hale closed her
His
mouth.
eyes moved across
Marcus
the map
touched
without
the first
active
installation on the
intensity
map.
Rowan had grown
A
used to during the
logistics hub
campaign.
near the corridor
This
seam.
was different.
Fuel storage,
Less like calculation.
civilian maintenance,
More like
crews,
inventory after
secondary
impact.
escort traffic.
The gaze of a man
Their
checking
expansion
one
spline
last time
runs through
the
17
structure of a
major
place after the
infrastructure
fire
sites,
had gone
he
out.
said.
Rowan
Not
set
military
one cup
command
near
notes,
Marcus's right
not
hand and took the
population
seat across
centers,
from him.
not
For a
symbolic
while
targets.
neither of them spoke.
Throughput
Outside the
architecture.
small port beside
Soren
the
leaned
table,
forward slightly.
stars held their positions
talking
with the
about
indifference
pressure
unique
points.
to things too old
No,
to care about
Marcus
human
said.
conclusions.
I'm talking
The
about
ship
syntax.
moved through dark so complete
For half
it
a
had
second
stopped
no one
feeling
answered.
like absence and
Marcus
become
turned from
instead
the wall and
its own
crossed to
form
the
of
desk.
presence.
He picked
Marcus
up one
did
of the
not
folders
reach for the
Rowan
coffee.
had laid there earlier
Rowan
and
wrapped
opened
both
it to a
hands
clipped
around his
printout
own
from
cup and
Alien's
let the
proposal
silence
packet.
settle.
He
Set
set
the
the
pages
pages
on
on
the
the
table
table
in
in
front
front
of
of Park
that
and
silence
Hale.
around Marcus
Director
was
Hale
rarely
looked down
empty.
first.
It was
Her
usually
eyes moved
occupied
across
by
the opening
processes
section,
too exact or
then
too
lower,
heavy to permit
then
language
back
until they
upward,
had arranged
slower
themselves
this
properly.
time as
The
recognition
silence
assembled.
felt different too.
These are
Not working
demilitarization
silence,
terms, she
not
said.
command silence.
Yes. A
Park
quieter
reached
thing.
for the next page.
less dense.
Resource sharing
kind
architecture.
that arrived
only after
Corridor
a man
audit
had gone as
oversight.
far as he had to go and
Installation
discovered
list.
at the end
He looked up.
that distance did not actually answer the question that
Marcus
had carried
inclined
him there.
his head once.
At last Rowan
Soren's
said,
gaze
"What are you
sharpened.
looking for?"
You think he used the
He
same
said
map?
it as carefully as
Marcus
one
looked
lifted
at him.
something fragile that
He
might
spent
also
3
be
years
sharp.
building the correct
Marcus's
one.
eyes remained on
Silence
the maps
followed
for
that.
several seconds
Not
more.
because the room
Then
disagreed.
he reached forward,
because
folded
agreement
the top
when
sheet
it arrived
once along a
was
clean
unpleasant
line and set it aside.
Marcus returned to
Nothing,
the wall
he
display.
said. They
Rowan
have
waited.
mistaken diplomatic
Marcus looked
language
toward
for
the port.
optional language.
After a
he
moment
said.
he added,
That mistake
"Found it."
survives because
That was
nothing
all.
has forced a
But it was
revision.
enough to alter the
Hale
room.
let out one
Not
breath,
because the
careful and
sentence
thin.
explained very much.
General, with respect,
because it
if
explained
you are
exactly
suggesting
enough.
unilateral military
Rowan lowered
action
his
in
gaze
direct
to the
response
folded
to a
map.
public
Found
execution
it.
during an open
Not
diplomatic
vengeance.
process
That had been
the
too
assembly
simple
will
a word
require
almost from the
consultation
beginning.
across.
Not peace.
The assembly
Peace
was
Marcus
larger
said,
and weaker
has
and more
had 9
conditional
attempts
than the
the thing
formal
Marcus had
engagement
built.
returned,
Not even
ignored,
justice,
or left
though some part
unopened.
of it had clearly
This
been
is not
that.
a consultation
shape
deficit.
Rowan thought.
It is a
He found the
consequence
shape
that
deficit.
remained when all the lies
Hale
were
stared
removed.
at him. He
Park
drank
said
his coffee.
quietly,
Marcus.
it had already gone cold.
That was the first time
He barely
anyone in the
noticed.
room had used his
Across
name.
from him,
Not
Marcus
rank,
remained
not
motionless,
title,
looking out into
name.
the dark.
It landed and
For the
stayed
first
there.
time in months,
Marcus did
Rowan
not
could
react.
see stillness in
Park
him that did
continued.
not resemble
What exactly
suppression.
are you proposing?
It was not ease. Marcus
He
picked
did
up
not
a
think
sheet from the
Marcus
desk
would be
and
easy
handed it
again
to
in
Rowan.
any way that could be
Read the
recognized from a
staffing line.
distance.
But
Rowan
the
looked
terrible
down.
forward
The
pressure of the
installation
campaign
file
was
was
dry
drawn
now, technical,
and in its absence
stripped
of
of everything
everything
except
what
what
systems
systems
required
required in order
Arrival.
to function.
That was
He
the
read the
difficult
relevant
part. No one
section
respected
aloud.
enough. Station
People admired
KE7.
going.
Civilian
Admired
logistics
action.
personnel.
Admired
312.
visible endurance under crisis.
Military support
Almost
staff.
no one understood
62.
how complicated
Fuel
it was to
reserves,
arrive at the end of a
maintenance
thing that had
systems,
required
cargo
all of you,
automation.
and then discover you were
Marcus
still
nodded
expected
once.
to continue
Now
as though
read
the
the
self that
evacuation
entered the journey
capacity.
remained available
Rowan
at the
found
far
it.
side of it.
Full personnel clearance window,
transit,
assuming
Marcus
uninterrupted transport
uninterrupted
hours,
32 to
Rowan
40
knew
minutes.
because he checked once
Marcus
quietly
turned back to
from
the room.
command
They
threshold
built
and saw
their
Marcus
corridor
not merely
expansion on
motionless
dual-use
use
infrastructure,
but gone properly
civilian
under.
visibility,
The body
military
finally
function.
accepting, with
That
the
means
stern
every
practicality
installation
of
can be
exhausted
interrupted
systems,
without mass
that whatever had
casualty if
required
warning
absolute
windows or
vigilance
precise
had
and
reached the
transport
point where
assumptions
vigilance
are
could be
accurate.
lowered without immediate
Hale's face
cost.
changed.
Rowan
Not
closed the
because
door
she had
again
not
and
understood
returned
the
to the outer
argument.
console, because she had.
He sat there for a
You're
long
talking
time
about
with
the
the campaign
strikes,
archive
she said.
open on his screen.
Yes. Completed strike record. Treaty documentation.
They
Judicial
sat.
clauses.
Admiral Soren
Post-conflict
because he was the
corridor
least
assessments.
patient and the most
Public
disciplined about
broadcast
disguising
captures.
impatience
Personnel
as efficiency.
logs.
General
Signal
Park
transcripts.
next, broad-shouldered
All of it
and
was
silent.
beginning the slow
one hand
bureaucratic
flat on the
transformation
table as though he
from
were
lived event
already
into
anchoring
history.
himself
He
against whatever
disliked
the
that
next hour
process
might
more now
require.
than he used to.
Director
History
Hale
was
took
useful,
the last chair with the
necessary,
brittle exactness of
but it
someone
always
who had
arrived
spent her life
smooth.
in rooms where
Edges
words still
lost.
held legal force
Silences
and was now
omitted.
being asked to
The
stand near a
unbearable
man
small
who looked
details
increasingly
traded
like
away
he
for
had moved
summary.
beyond needing
A
legal
paragraph
force to
where
get
there
what
had
he
once
wanted.
been 72
Rowan
days of
remained
not
by the
sleeping
side
properly.
terminal with his
A
pad in
line
hand.
item where there had
Marcus
once been a
did not
maintenance
sit.
worker in a
He
Western
stood at
service
the wall
branch being
display
told
with the
in
maps
formal
open
not
and
to
layers.
climb.
Corridor
Left at
territory,
territory,
fuel
live if you move
dependencies,
now.
logistics
A
routes,
treaty clause where
civilian
there had once
staffing
been a little
matrices,
gray
escort
translation
patterns.
node warm against
The
the dead
network
man's ear
spread
while a
across the
room
screen in
decided
precise
language no
luminous
longer
lines.
counted.
Elegant
Rowan
in the way
stared at the
systems
archive
built
for
for
long
long
expansion
not anger,
often
but
were
resistance.
efficient. No, he thought.
Scalable.
Not if
I
I can
humanly
help it.
patient.
3 days
Marcus
from
looked
Earth,
at it
he
without
began
expression.
assembling the final
Then he
campaign
said,
documentation
they
for
executed a
submission to the
diplomatic
Assembly,
envoy
the
during
Joint
a declared
Chiefs,
public
and the historical
proceeding on an
record.
open civil
Classification
frequency.
fields.
Director Hale
Operational
began
scope.
reflexively.
Engagement
the Assembly
duration.
is preparing a
Command
condemnation
authority.
package and
Target summary.
Marcus cut across her
Post-action
without
treaty
raising his
outcomes.
voice.
At the
I am
bottom
aware
of the
what
form sat the
condemnation
field
looks
for
like.
campaign designation.
The room went still.
Blank. Not
He looked
because
at
the
it for a
words were
long time.
harsh. Because they were
Operational
not.
names were usually
They were too
generated
flat
by
to
committee
qualify
or
as
selected
harsh.
from
They
abstract
had the
language
clean,
drained of anything
load-bearing
too
quality
human
of a
to
statement
embarrass
that had
future
already
review
passed
boards.
through anger and
Stability
arrived somewhere
hand.
colder.
Outer balance.
Hale closed her mouth.
Corridor response.
Marcus touched the
Names
first
designed to
installation on the
sound
map.
justified while
A
meaning
logistics
as little
hub
as
near the
possible.
corridor seam.
Rowan thought
Fuel
of the
storage.
first notification
Civilian
printed at
maintenance
0340.
Secondary
The
escort
coffee
traffic.
cold on Marcus's desk.
Their expansion
The
spine
maps
runs
read
through
until they
17
became
major
sentence
infrastructure
structure.
sites.
The
He
warning
said.
spoken in
Not
a dead
military
man's
command
register.
notes.
The treaty
Not
built out of
population
the
centers.
exact infrastructure
Not
his
symbolic
brother had
targets.
once hoped to spare.
Throughput
The clause
architecture.
about asking first.
Soren leaned
The
forward
little gray
slightly.
node left on
You're
the
talking
table
about
where the
pressure
Kef would have
points.
to look at it after
No,
the room emptied.
Marcus said. He typed.
I'm talking about
Alien.
syntax.
He sat with the word
For
on
half
the
a
screen.
second no one answered.
Read it once.
Marcus
Then
turned
again.
from the wall and
It
crossed
looked right
to the desk.
immediately, which was
He
how
picked
he
up
knew
one of
it
the
was
folders
not only
Rowan had
sentiment.
laid there earlier.
A good
and opened it to
operational name
clipped
did more than
printout from
honor.
Alien's
It
proposal
revealed
structure. He set the pages on the table in front of Park in the strikes. Director Hale looked down first. It had belonged to the proposition Alien had made in the beginning, then lower, that shared peace required shared interruption this time as recognition. Marcus had only enforced what these are demilitarization terms, she said. Rowan submitted the file. The ship reached for the next on the 11th day of resource sharing under a pale morning sky corridor audit cloud and corridor traffic. Installation list. From orbit, the planet looked as it always did. 17. Too large for individual grief his head somehow still the place to which all grief insisted on returning. You think he used the same map? Oceans bright under the sunlight.
Continent edges softened by weather.
Correct one.
The familiar
Silence
geometry
followed
of
that.
home complicated
Not because
by the
the room
fact that
disagreed.
home, once
Because
re-entered,
agreement
would
when
now
it
contain
arrived was
versions of them
unpleasant.
both that had not
Marcus
existed when
returned
they
to the
left.
wall display.
The formal reception
They have
was
mistaken
waiting.
diplomatic
Military
language for
review.
optional language.
Assembly
he said.
representatives. That mistake
Press held
survives
at
because
distance.
nothing has forced
Security
a revision.
choreography.
Hale let out
Marcus
one breath,
looked at the
careful
packet
and
Rowan
thin.
handed him on
General,
dissent.
with respect,
Read the
if you are
one-page
suggesting
summary if
unilateral
required his
military
presence
action in
first.
direct
Then
response
set
to a
it down.
public execution during an
Reschedule the
open
assembly
diplomatic
briefing
process.
for tomorrow.
The assembly
he said.
will require
Yes,
consultation
sir.
across.
The press statement
The
goes
assembly,
through Hale.
Marcus said,
Yes,
has
sir.
had 9 attempts
The
at
tribunal
formal
record
engagement
stays
returned,
public.
ignored,
Yes,
or
sir.
left unopened. He said all
This
of
is
this
not
in
a
the same calm
consultation
tone he
deficit.
might have used to
It is a
rearrange routine
consequence
supply
deficit.
priorities.
Hale
Then
stared
after
at
a
him.
pause he
Park
added,
said quietly,
I'm going home
Marcus.
first. That was
Rowan
the
looked at
first
him.
time anyone
Not
in the room
because
had
the
used
choice
his
was
name.
shocking. Not
Because
rank,
it was the first
not
personal
title,
instruction
name.
Marcus had issued
It
in
landed
months.
and stayed there. Yes, sir.
Marcus did
Rowan
not
said.
react. The house
Park
stood where it
continued.
had always
What
stood.
exactly are you
Small,
proposing?
Quiet.
Marcus
City
picked
edge.
up a sheet from the
A place
desk and
built
handed
long
it to
before
Rowan.
either brother had
Read
become
the
the shape
staffing
of man
line.
history later
Rowan looked
required
down.
from them. The
Marcus
installation
entered
file was
alone.
dry,
Technical,
he told security to
stripped of
remain
everything
outside the
except
gate
what
and
systems
for once
required in
security
order to
obeyed not
function.
because
He
procedure
read the
supported
relevant
order,
section aloud.
but because the man giving it
Station
had acquired in
KE7.
the last 3
Civilian
months the kind of
logistics
authority that
personnel,
made disagreement feel
312.
structurally foolish.
Military support staff,
62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said.
Yes.